This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate second and final part of what if Naruto found God King of Hueco Mundo in Uzumaki Master Temple. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no more time. Let's start the story.
Knowing that there was nothing he could do to help him, Sarutobi could only grit his teeth in frustration. Baragan's ability to rot and decay anything would turn Monkey King Enma to dust before he could even land a blow, so it wouldn't really help to summon him and have him change into the adamantine staff. In addition, he was too old to compete with a monster that was not only stronger than him but also had a younger, faster body in order to leave Baragan grinning and the terrified villagers appalled at seeing their Hokage back down. He had his Anbu gather up the civilians who had tried to attack him and had them taken to the hospital before returning to his office. End of flashback. There were only a few more blows after that before they finally realized that their former punching bag would not put up with any more of their nonsense. Even though he wasn't in control of his body at the time, that didn't matter. To be honest, though, it brought back memories of Baragan's time as Hueco Mundo's ruler. They were terrified and did whatever he asked them to do after wreaking a bloody swath of destruction on anyone who would challenge his authority. This made things simpler when he went to the bank to find out how much money they had stolen on Minato and Kushina's orders. The account had dropped to less than half of its former level, getting the bank's manager to give Baragan an invoice detailing the money's destination and then compel him to reverse the flow didn't take long. Before Baragan silenced them and took all of their money to reimburse Naruto for the money they had stolen, some of the more foolishly brave civilians who had chosen to dip their greedy hands into the account decided to voice their displeasure. This left the once egregiously wealthy and incredibly arrogant people forced to live in the lowest form of poverty. Even though Baragan wanted to kill the bothersome insects, he found it much more amusing to punish conceited idiots like them. In the end, Baragan believed that those people had done nothing to merit such a position of wealth and power. Rather, it must be earned, much like he did when he was rightfully king of Hueco Mundo. And not through small-time intrigues or theft. Taking all of their wealth and power was extremely satisfying to the old Hollow because it actually reminded him a little bit of Aizen. After finishing that, Baragan reviewed his mental to-do list. The money that was taken from Naruto had already been handled by him. They had successfully intimidated the villagers into compliance. Although he would have been delighted to murder Sarutobi and his accomplices, he was unable to do so since Jiraiya had not yet returned to the village. Furthermore, he would grant Naruto that pleasure even though he enjoyed putting these people in their proper places. He would not deny Naruto the freedom to kill Sarutobi and his cronies. However, he saw fit nothing would be more satisfying than thwarting Sarutobi's scheme and then seeing him killed by the very person he sought to use as a pawn. Sarutobi's use of Naruto was similar to his use of Aizen in many ways. Similar to how Aizen deprived Baragan of his kingdom and authority, Sarutobi aimed to deprive Naruto of everything for his own benefit. It was ironic that Kyoka Suigetsu herself apologized for forcing Baragan to submit to him due to his complete hypnosis ability, but with Sarutobi, he attempted to have the entire village mistreat the boy in an effort to mentally condition him into being subservient, and he also had seals placed on him to aid in this. However, Baragan refused to let things end the way they had for him. Where the manipulator got away with their crimes, he wanted the personal satisfaction of killing the bastard himself. Even though he thought Choitsu's plan to leave Aizen with a fake Hogyoku with a limited amount of energy would ultimately fail and the backlash on his being would be quite bad, and he was going to ensure that Naruto could accomplish precisely that. Nevertheless, before he was completely consumed by Naruto, he still had a lot of things to deal with. Even though Minato didn't want to think it, he suspected his former mentor was involved in this. Tsunade and Jiraiya were the ones who were supposed to look after him. After all, Jiraiya was the most devoted Sennin, and even though Orochimaru might have been Sarutobi's best student, there was little doubt that the man was aware of what was happening. Jiraiya almost always complied with Sarutobi's requests. What more could the deceased orphan boy have done than try anything to win his teacher's approval? While Tsunade belonged to the Senju clan and Orochimaru was a prodigy, Jiraiya was a nobody who was having difficulty keeping up. It should come as no surprise that Jiraiya would quickly become Sarutobi's yes man when paired with two such individuals. In addition to the unresolved issues in Konoha, there were also more private issues. Similar to what Naruto truly intended to do after breaking free from the seal. The boy wasn't entirely certain, but he was certain that he would deal the final blows to anyone who tried to control him. He could easily conquer Konoha and the entire Land of Fire if he so desired, since, like Baragan, he would eventually wish to establish his own kingdom. After all, Naruto would inherit some of his personality in addition to his abilities. Time passed much more quickly inside the seal, so the boy had plenty of time to review his plans. While Baragan is in charge, inside the seal, time passed quickly. Baragan had spent several months inside the seal during the brief time he had been in charge. Kyuubi and Naruto had become much closer during that period. To her dismay, he didn't blush nearly as much or as severely when she was playing tricks on him. However, this only inspired her to put in more effort. Even though it was challenging, Naruto was able to somewhat open up Choetsu. Given that she started out as a genderless ball with the power to essentially defy the laws of the universe in order to fulfill the wishes of its wielder, such as when Aizen attempted to use her to become a god. If he had her for a long enough period of time, it was actually feasible, but something that big took time nevertheless. It was difficult to get her to express herself despite her long life. It appeared that she lacked social skills because her only friends were Kyoka and Baragan, the latter of whom she hardly spoke to. Instead, Naruto tried a different tactic and inquired about her father. She spoke extensively about her father and creator, Kazuki Urahara, so it seemed to work. Naruto wondered why she looked so different from the man when she conjured up an image of him in her mind. She did have blonde hair like him, of course, but that was about the only similarity he could see. She then displayed a picture of the person who inspired her appearance. And Naruto would have blushed at her beauty if Kyuubi hadn't been taunting him all the time. From the picture, Naruto could tell that Yoruichi Shihoin was a tall, slender, dark-skinned woman with golden eyes and long purple hair that she wore in a ponytail. Black stretch pants, a pair of lightweight brown shoes, an orange overshirt with 2 white straps on each shoulder, and a large beige sash around her waist complete her outfit, which Naruto said aloud for stealth. However, she was breathtakingly beautiful to Naruto. Kyuubi said, "If you wanted to stare at a woman, you know I would have been more than happy to oblige," despite the fact that he had entered while Naruto was examining Yoruichi's figure. Or am I not attractive enough? That's not it at all. You're beautiful, Kyuubi, exclaimed an abashed Naruto. Naturally, Kyuubi took advantage of this and, believing he was in trouble, got a frightened Naruto to list his favorite things about her. For example, her magnificent appearance with her 9 tails, her exceptionally soft fur, her personality, though she was always making fun of him, but he knew it was all in good humor, and so forth. Despite not expecting him to fall for her plow, Kyuubi was genuinely moved by his candor and thanked him with a chaste kiss. To their surprise, however, Choetsu had pulled Naruto away from her, claiming that she was interfering with their time together. Naruto and Kyuubi, however, were aware that it went beyond that. She felt envious. In fact, she was envious of Kyuubi. This actually made Naruto happy. In contrast to Kyoka Suigetsu, with whom Naruto got along well, she was initially quite apathetic and monotonous before gradually opening up to him. This is because both of their circumstances were fairly similar, given that they were both being used and abused by insane men who only wanted them for their own purposes. And that was how it went for a while through training with his parents and sometimes Baragan himself when he went to sleep in the real world and appeared in the seal itself. Naruto continued to grow closer to Kyuubi, Kyoka Suigetsu, and to a lesser extent Choetsu. However, they were taken aback to discover that, despite being totally cut off from yin chakra, Kyuubi had somehow recovered some of it. They had no idea how it could be. However, Kyuubi acknowledged when questioned that she detested the thought of having to wait for M to return her yin chakra. Anato's body and yearned for a real-life relationship with Naruto. She was gradually regaining her yin chakra on her own after hearing this, which could only mean that her desire had responded to Choetsu's power. That wasn't all, though Choetsu was shocked to see that Kyuubi's body had actually evolved to be able to regain her yin chakra, since normally she couldn't have done so. As a result, Kyuubi was effectively no longer a Biju but rather something completely different. But when Kyuubi asked Choetsu if she would be able to have children now, that's what really got her. Despite her intense love for Naruto, she was still a Biju and lacked DNA because, in the end, she was only a sentient chakra construct with a human form, an imitation at best. Since a Biju was not genuinely organic, it was unable to produce. She had essentially given up on ever having a family before, so when she learned that she had not only begun to regain her yin chakra but had also transformed into something more than a Biju, she couldn't help but hope that her desire to be able to start one would be fulfilled. However, a small glimmer of hope had begun to burn inside of her due to Choetsu's ability to turn someone's wishes into reality, and she could only hope she was correct if she had been able to start regaining her lost yin chakra without needing to remove the half from Minato's body, as well as seemingly transform into something more than a Biju. Choetsu just stared at Kyuubi for a long time without responding. Her fear that her wish had not been fulfilled and that she would never experience the joys of motherhood grew stronger the longer it lasted. Of not being able to have children with the one man she ever loved, or even having children at all. Something grabbed her hand just as she was about to have a panic attack. She turned to face Naruto, who who was firmly grasping her hand. She could see love and total devotion in his eyes, and even though they didn't exchange words, she understood what he was attempting. That when their relationship progressed to that point while they were both in the real world, he would still love her and remain with her even if she was unable to conceive. She fell even more in love with him. If that were possible, Naruto's eyes showed that he was a little hurt and surprised that she hadn't told him, and she had always been worried about how he would react if she told him she couldn't have children. However, since it wasn't something that was readily discussed, there was also understanding in his eyes. However, everyone else smiled as they watched Naruto support Kyuubi through this. Even though Kyuubi might not be able to conceive if Choetsu discovered that she couldn't, Minato and Kushina were proud that their son supported her. However, unless Kyuubi permitted Naruto to have other women, Kushina was a little disappointed that this would mean she would not have any grandchildren from them. But Kyoka Suigetsu, who had always been a romantic at heart, was crying in public. Baragan had departed. Unconcerned, Naruto didn't like sentimental moments like this, so he decided to leave and wait for it to end. Even though he saw him as his grandfather and the seal fused his being into the boy he would be in a way. She wasn't just staring at Kyuubi, though, with Choetsu. Instead, she had been examining herself to determine whether she could fulfill her desire to have children. Although it was clear that Kyuubi's body was changing beyond being a simple energy construct, she had not yet completed her evolution, making it impossible to determine with certainty whether or not she would be able to conceive once it was complete. Since Choetsu's abilities only worked when someone truly wanted something, she realized that her fear of not being able to conceive was actually working against her. After all, how could someone ever hope to have what they truly desired if they allowed fear to get in the way? However, everything changed when Naruto grabbed her hand. Love and hope took the place of her fear. Kyuubi was able to overcome her fear because Naruto demonstrated that he would stick by her no matter how she responded to Kyuubi's question. At last, Choetsu smiled at them and spoke, "Kyuubi, while at first it was difficult to tell, as your body is right now in the process of changing, and won't be finished until you've fully regained your yin energy, but I can say with certainty, that by the time you do regain your yin energy and are able to leave the seal, your body will be fully capable of bearing children." When she was done, Kyuubi's happiness was beyond words. She started to cry tears of sheer happiness, and in her shock, her legs failed her, causing her to fall, only to be swiftly grabbed by Naruto. As he embraced her, a worried Naruto asked, "Q-chan, are you okay?" When he learned that she would be able to have children, he was undoubtedly ecstatic. With tears still streaming from her eyes, Kyuubi turned to face him, unable to find another way to show her happiness. She put her arms around his neck and gave him a passionate kiss. Ultimately, what other way could someone convey their happiness at the prospect of having children with their significant other? Naruto returned the kiss with all of his love. After he had recovered from his surprise at the unexpected kiss, he could always feel his love for her growing. Even though he knew it wasn't as strong as hers, however, he hoped Kyuubi wouldn't mind delaying having kids because there were a lot of issues that needed to be resolved before they could begin a family in harmony. However, Kushina coughed uncomfortably into her hand to attract Naruto and Kyuubi's attention when it became clear that they would not be ending their kiss anytime soon. It was a little difficult for her to see her son already in a romantic relationship, even though she was happy for the two of them. It was hard enough to move past the fact that she hadn't seen either of her children since they were newborns, and then she saw her son as a young adult for the second time. But he was already with Kyuubi after spending roughly 2 months in the seal. Kyuubi had stated that she was okay with other women joining as long as she gave the go-ahead, so she wasn't sure if she wanted to be happy about having so many grandchildren or angry at all the little harlots who were going to try to get their hands on her son. Hold on for a moment. Would it be feasible for Kyuubi to break free from the seal and be with her son in the real world if she were to develop beyond being merely a chakra construct and even acquire the ability to conceive? At some point, she would have to discuss that with Choetsu. The office of Sarutobi, the old Hokage, had been having a rough time. There was nothing he could do to stop his plans from collapsing at the seams. Many of the now wealthy Konoha families who had embezzled from Naruto's account were forced to reimburse him by Baragan, leaving the impoverished and homeless with virtually nothing. By forcing the store owners to give him the rights, he also seized control of every store that had overcharged Naruto or sold him subpar goods. Hell, he couldn't even properly bury the people who were killed because there were no remains of them to bury after Baragan finished with them. If only Jiraiya could be here. Sarutobi turned to see Jiraiya leaning against the window as someone said, "Jiz-sensei, are you really that unhappy to see me?" At this, Sarutobi received a checkmark. "How many times have I told you to use the door?" Jiraiya laughed aloud, then he became serious and said, "Too many to count. Now, what the hell was that giant beam of red light I saw nearly a week ago? And I'm guessing it has something to do with the letter you sent me, so tell me, what is going on? Sarutobi exhaled deeply. I'm afraid that things have gotten serious, and our plans are in serious jeopardy. Village gates. At the same moment, the two gate guards, Azumo and Katetsu, felt that their typically dull duties had become more interesting in recent days. After all, it wasn't every day that Jinchuriki, a local, was taken over by a monster and essentially took over the village. The majority of the villagers believed that beating the boy into submission would be easy and that everything would return to normal. Until a large number of ninja and civilians perished, some of the more intelligent residents of Konoha actually packed up and left when they realized that Naruto, or rather, Baragan, would not submit. There were still those who foolishly thought that things would return to normal. The eternal gate guards, however, were wiser. The entire Leaf Village was about to undergo a transformation. A thump. Azumo said, "Hey Katetsu, did you hear something?" A bored Katetsu remarked, "You're just hearing things." A thump. Azumo said, "There it is again," as he tried to identify the source of the sound. A thump. However, each time the sounds were heard, the ground began to tremble. Katetsu looked down the path where the noise seemed to be coming from and exclaimed, "What the hell is that?" Despite their best efforts, they could hardly see anything moving in the direction of Konoha. The ground started to shake more violently, and before long, their small guard post was trembling more and more as the source of the shaking drew closer. After a while, they managed to discern a human figure. "Hold on a minute, is that?" Azuma wondered, his eyes wide. Katetsu said, "Yeah, it is." After a few more tremors, the source of them passed them by without a single glance. Tsunade Senju, the slug princess, had at last made her way back to Konoha, followed shortly after by her pet Tauntaun and apprentice Shizune. The two gatekeepers also observed that she appeared extremely irate. Konoha. Upon seeing Jiraiya in his office, Sarutobi was overjoyed. Even though Tenzo had not yet returned from his mission, at least now that Jiraiya was here, he could finally devise a strategy to restore order. He was still skilled enough to deal with a Jinchuriki, even though his student's artistic knowledge was inferior to that of Minato or even Kushina. Naruto was still, in a way, a Jinchuriki. Only the contents of the seal had altered. However, they sensed it before they could even start discussing it. The ground was trembling. However, they were both aware that it was not an earthquake. No, the ground began to tremble more and more. They had both felt it before and knew exactly what was causing it. Tsunade was furious and stomping the ground so violently that it was shaking. Sarutobi really didn't need this at the moment. Ultimately, Sarutobi had ensured that she thought Naruto was dead in order to prevent her from raising him. It was true that he had eliminated Konoha's best healer for his scheme, but in his twisted mind, it was a necessary sacrifice to maintain order. But now that the elemental nations had heard about that enormous beam of light, there was no way he could convince her that Naruto was still alive. After all, no human being could have created that light or such energy. The only way he could hope would be if Baragan killed Tsunade before she could speak, but he was aware that was unlikely. He had to duck when the door to his office flew at him, flew straight through his window, and took off like a gigantic wooden frisbee, indicating that Tsunade was closer than he had initially believed, and Tsunade Senju was standing in the doorway. Then he folded his hands and sighed, trying to maintain a straight face. Sarutobi said, "Hello Tsunade." Tsunade entered the room and stood directly in front of Sarutobi's desk, saying, "I take it that you already know why I'm here. Then that makes this so much easier, and here I thought I was going to have to break some bones to get the truth out of you. I'm only going to ask once, where is Naruto Uzumaki?" replied Tsunade. Jiraiya tried to calm her down by saying, "Now princess, let's talk about this," but she got a fist stuck so deep in his stomach that he coughed up blood when she brought it back. "Don't even try it, Jiraiya. The two of you lied to me. Kept the only living relative I had from me. To live alone in this village. I know perfectly well how people treat Jinchuriki, and with the Kyuubi attack, even the people of Konoha would have treated Naruto as nothing more than a monster. So tell me where he is, or you're going to have a nice hole in your chest cavity, right where your lung is." Tsunade said she was never one for subtlety or meaningless threats. They were both aware that she would follow through on her threat. "Tsunade, while it may be true that we lied to you, it's not like we did anything wrong. We needed to keep Naruto within the village, so that our enemies would be wary of attacking us after the Kyuubi had attacked and you would have left the village with Naruto after his parents died," Sarutobi said, attempting to persuade T's deception. Even though Tsunade was a terrible gambler, she wasn't a moron, so today was actually his bad day. "Oh really? You honestly think you did nothing wrong? Well, let me tell you something. Kushina was actually the grandchild, my grandmother Mito's younger sister, making her my cousin. This makes her son Naruto a distant cousin of mine as well. And since the Senju and Uzumaki were already distant relatives anyway, you two have violated clan laws by interfering with my family. And last time I checked, not even the Hokage is allowed to interfere with another clan. Least of all the Senju and Uzumaki clans, and let's not forget that you're also a member of the Sarutobi clan Lord Hokage, making your crimes even worse as it's also forbidden for a clan to interfere with another clan. Let alone two. Tsunade was furious. And the eyes of Hiruzen and Jiraiya grew wide. She was correct. Hiruzen was still a member of the Sarutobi clan even as Hokage, and he had seriously abused his position of authority to meddle with the Senju and Uzumaki clans, even though the majority of the Leaf had forgotten that the latter was even a clan. The Sarutobi clan as a whole would have to compensate the Senju clan, the Uzumaki, or more accurately, Naruto, in addition to Hiruzen losing his position as Hokage for abusing his position. The thought makes him grit his teeth, however, because Jiraiya assisted Sarutobi in crafting his lie to Tsunade. He would also suffer grave repercussions since Jiraiya was not a member of any clan. His punishment would not be as harsh as Sarutobi's, but it would undoubtedly end badly for the Toad Sage because Tsunade could practically force him to give her anything she desired. Jiraiya only managed to say, "Now Tsunade, don't be hasty, surely we can talk this," before Tsunade put her hand around Jiraiya's neck and started choking him with her great strength, even lifting him into the air as he struggled to take her hand off. As her free hand glowed with chakra, indicating that she had activated the chakra scalpel technique, Tsunade declared, "I've had enough of your bullshit. Either you tell me where Naruto is right now, or I will take my pound of flesh from Jiraiya right now. And trust me when I say I will make it as bloody and horribly painful as possible." But a voice interrupted her before she could begin chopping Jiraiya up like a turkey. As he entered the office, Baragan remarked, "Well now, this is interesting. When I had felt the presence of both the Sennin, I came to see what your excuses were for leaving Naruto, and here I find that the Toad is a worthless traitor, and the Slug had been lied to. Damn it. This has only gotten worse," Sarutobi thought. Location: Fire Country, somewhere the Winged Hollow had been sprinting toward Konoha as quickly as she could. If she hadn't gone so damned far into Earth Country, she would have already arrived. In an attempt to care for Naruto as long as possible before she had to leave to attend to it, she had been suppressing her bloodlust as much as she could. Since she had attained this form and was no longer dependent on souls to satisfy her hunger, she believed that she had control over it. However, it didn't make her feel any less angry at the villagers, which only strengthened her desire to ruin their lot. However, she couldn't take the chance of killing Naruto, so she left, but not before eliminating some of his more violent detractors, which increased the likelihood that attacking him would curse the assailant. To be honest, she didn't mean to give them the impression that approaching Naruto too closely would bring him bad luck, but it worked to make his life easier. However, the attacks became virtually non-existent and only occurred when someone had the courage to flee, not that they lived much longer after she returned and killed them. She wished she could simply remove him from the village. The issue was that she didn't know where to take him. Furthermore, he was unable to see her, so even if she were to grab him and flee, he would undoubtedly be frightened. Even if he could see her, he would likely still be afraid. The main reason she didn't take him from the village, though, was because she was afraid she would kill him and eat his soul. No matter how much she didn't want him in the Leaf Village, she couldn't risk that. Though it wasn't visible through her mask, she smiled when she thought about him. Even though he couldn't see her, she could still do something special for him on his birthdays, like use her flames to create fireworks for him or employ her delusions on him while he was asleep to eliminate his nightmares and allow him to rest in peace in order to give him something decent to eat instead of the cheap and unhealthy foods he was typically forced to get. She had even stolen food and sneaked it into his apartment. She had promised her friend Kushina that she would look after her child to the best of her ability should anything happen to her, and she had kept it, even in death. But despite everything she had done for him over the years, the hurt she felt from her failure that evening would never go away. The massacre's night, even with all the lives she had saved that night, she couldn't save her own, and could not get to Naruto in time. The night she turned into a hollow, she had noticed that things at the compound had become a little tense in recent years. To be more precise, relations between the Uchiha clan and the rest of the village had never been good and had only gotten worse after Tobirama Senju, who was always suspicious, put the Uchiha clan in charge of the military police to keep an eye on them. Fugaku, that idiot, was now genuinely discussing a coup d'etat. The lunatic. A coup would only serve to further erode the village's already precarious position, which its adversaries would undoubtedly take advantage of. However, Fugaku, like many Uchiha, was conceited about the superiority of their clans. Of course, there were those who opposed it, but they remained silent out of fear of what the rebellion's supporters would do to them, since many of them had become unstable. She honestly wished she could simply kill Fugaku and seize control of the clan, but the man had succeeded in enacting some rather sexist laws that restricted the position to male clan leaders. In the event that he passed away, she would have to wed the new leader in order to continue serving as the clan's matriarch. Which, given that the clan council also supported Fugaku's plan, would probably mean that one of his crazy supporters would replace him. She was certain that Sarutobi already knew they were up to something because she had noticed her son Itachi acting strangely lately, so it's not like she could go to the Hokage. He seemed to be growing more aloof with each passing moment. Furthermore, his behavior upon learning of Shisui's alleged suicide was noteworthy. She knew Shisui personally, so she couldn't imagine him killing himself. However, given Itachi's behavior, she feared that Itachi might have killed Shisui and acquired the Mangekyo Sharingan. She hoped she was mistaken, but given the current state of affairs, she couldn't shake the suspicion that things would only get worse in the near future. She sighed and tried to think of something more cheerful. Immediately, she couldn't help but think of Naruto, her best friend's son. He was always so energetic and such a pleasure to be around. Since Tsunade had left the village without taking Naruto with her or even remaining to raise him, she would have adopted him right away if she could have, since Senju and Uzumaki were related. Tsunade and Kushina were, after all, very close. However, she was unable to think about those things. She had to focus on taking care of Naruto and preventing her clan from acting foolishly for as long as possible regardless of his actual allegiance. At least she had her son Itachi assisting her with that aspect. However, it occurred shortly after Shisui's passing. She had learned of the plan to destroy the Uchiha clan and have Itachi carry out the destruction through her crow summon. She needed to move quickly. What could she do, though? She couldn't possibly warn the innocent clan members who didn't want to join Fugaku's craziness, and if she did, those zealots would probably hear about it and act foolishly within the Leaf Village. It would probably turn into a full-fledged civil war. Despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation, she made a valiant effort to come up with a solution. Then, however, she experienced an odd feeling like a pull on her awareness. It began in the recesses of her mind. She felt as though a genjutsu was being applied to her, but it wasn't. Inquisitive and uncertain of what else to do, she let the emotion consume her as she considered rescuing her clan and her best friend's child. The sensation appeared to leap on those emotions, then was amplified almost tenfold before all of a sudden, pain. One that was unlike anything she had ever experienced in her eyes caused her to drop to her knees in pain and start crying bloody tears. When the emotion passed, she could see her own reflection, along with her new eyes, in a puddle of her blood beneath her. Their eyes had changed from being the typical Sharingan eyes to resembling a lotus blossom. She was unaware of the situation or how it had occurred, but she was certain of one thing: she had attained the legendary Mangekyo Sharingan. She got up, getting used to her new eyes, and quickly wiped the blood from her face. In response to her desire, she felt as though the Mangekyo had somehow reawakened within her. However, how could that have happened? She had more important things to do, so she shook her head of that line of thinking. That wasn't how the Sharingan's next level was supposed to be unlocked, similar to rescuing her clansmen. She didn't know how she knew how to save them. She only knew that she had somehow managed to do so because she felt the power of her eyes activate when she saw the first person she knew wasn't a part of Fugaku's plan, and that person quickly disappeared. She grinned at the fact that she had managed to save the innocent while letting the guilty perish, despite the slight sting in her eyes from whatever method she had used on him. Later on, maybe Makoto was seen with a hand over her eyes and panting heavily. She had misjudged the physical strain that using her new eyes excessively would cause. It was only a tingling feeling in her eyes. At first her vision was becoming fuzzy and they felt as though they were on fire. In addition to her uncertainty about whether she had reached all of the defenseless Uchiha, she still had to locate Naruto and use her power to send him to the same location as the other Uchiha. She only knew that they had been sent to a safe place, but she didn't know exactly where. Letting out a sigh, she slowly stood back up, and trying hard to focus with her blurred vision. Despite the excessive use of her eyes, she was still able to identify what was what. But before she could go very far, she gasped when she felt something, only to look down at her chest and see that her shirt was getting wet with blood and that a blade was sticking through it. She clutched at her stab wound as she fell to the ground. After the blade was removed, she turned to look behind her and saw who it was. Despite her fuzzy vision, Fugaku, her bastard of a husband. She could practically feel his twisted grin plastered on his face, no doubt because he wanted her Mangekyo Sharingan eyes for himself. He wouldn't be able to get his hands on them, though, because Itachi had just entered the room, saw what Fugaku had done, and summoned the Amaterasu. Fugaku had perished in a very agonizing, fiery death at the hands of the Black Flames. Itachi went to his mother after Fugaku was dead and held her close while she bled to death. She soon died as well. Regretting not being able to save Naruto from the village before she was killed, she closed her eyes and let death claim her. When she opens them again, her vision becomes clear and she can see the same room where she was stabbed. What was going on here? Looking down at where she had felt the sword pierce her, she instead found some strange chain attached to her chest. She gasped as she turned to look around and saw her son lay down her body and pull out a sealing scroll. I'm sorry that I have to do this, mother, but I can't allow anyone to get their hands on your Mangekyo Sharingan. I may not know what abilities they held, but whatever they might be able to do is not something I can allow to fall into the wrong hands, Itachi said as he removed his mother's eyes from her torso. Having to watch her own son take her eyes from her lifeless body made her a little queasy, but she knew it was necessary. She heard someone next to her exclaim, "Goddamn it all," and turned to see Fugaku, who also had an odd chain on his chest. "You," he exclaimed, gesturing to Makoto. "You've ruined everything. You knew this was going to happen, but you didn't warn us. Instead, you evacuated the members who weren't with me, didn't you? Had you warned us, we could have banded together and occupied the village. We could have." He punched himself in the stomach, causing him to double over in agony, stopping his tirade. "Shut the hell up," Makoto said, glaring at Fugaku. "Why in the world would I warn you and your insane followers? You and the others have become so delusional in the supposed superiority of our clan, which you wanted to stage a coup d'etat and take over the village. And yet you honestly never wondered why I never wanted to have sex with you, instead opting to have a child through artificial means. I would never sully myself by sleeping with a deranged and disgusting man like you. I may have been forced into marrying you because of your silver-tongued father, but that didn't mean I was going to become some kind of housewife. Hell, you even despise Kushina's son Naruto, not because of the Kyuubi or anything like that, but because Minato got with her and you didn't, and to think you actually thought you had a chance with her, but then again you were incredibly delusional," Makoto replied. She was unaware that the chain on her chest had developed mouths and was consuming itself. During all of this neither of them noticed because Fugaku was too furious with Makoto for pointing out all of his shortcomings. "Enough. I'm tired of listening to this. You should have simply bowed your head and accepted your fate like a good little bitch, but you had to be defiant. You even went behind my back to help the son of that red-haired whore you called a friend, and her little shit stain of a son. In fact, I'm glad I told that masked man about her being pregnant." Makoto's anger at Fugaku and how he had ruined a good portion of her life and his confession about selling out Kushina being pregnant with Naruto was what broke the camel's back. She had always been curious about his whereabouts on the night of the Kyuubi attack, but she never imagined that his jealousy and rage would drive him to take part in the attack directly. Then it took place. The base of the chain on her chest had broken completely, and the chain itself had finished eating itself as her spiritual body disintegrated and reassembled into its new shape. Makoto was engulfed in a thick cloud of smoke. The creature that had once been Makoto Uchiha's gaping maw would be the last thing Fugaku saw when the smoke cleared. End of flashback. Makoto sighed and became aware that she had paused, gazing at the moon and thinking back on how she had come to be who she is. She had to quickly set off again after remembering which way Konoha was, complaining to herself that she had been wasting time. When Tsunade had returned, Sarutobi Hiruzen's situation had deteriorated significantly. She had used the old laws that many had forgotten against him, and coupled with his abuse of his position and power, and stripped of his title and power as Hokage, and had heavy restraints put on him. Hell, even his foolish grandson could kill him at this point due to their involvement in his crimes. Even his teammates and advisors were imprisoned and stripped of all authority. Danzo was the only one who had avoided going to jail because he spoke with Baragan. However, the explanation was rather intriguing. Rewind. In the dead of night, a lone robed figure was moving across Konoha without being noticed. His ability to stay hidden and his skill at stealth were evidence of his lengthy and prosperous career as a true shinobi. He made sure that no one would know about his self-imposed mission, which was to meet with Baragan and reveal specific information to him, by keeping his lone eye peeled and glancing this way, and that it had to be done for Konoha's benefit. The robed figure skillfully manipulated the seals on the front gate of the Namikaze estate to gain entry, demonstrating yet another demonstration of his mastery of the ninja arts. As soon as he was inside, darkness fell and he heard the gate behind him clang shut. "Danzo Shimura, I presume?" a familiar voice called out from the shadows. Danzo bowed formally and said, "Your memory serves you well, Baragan Dono," believing that Baragan could see him through the darkness, a portion of the darkness before Danzo revealed Naruto Uzumaki's hollow-possessed body. "You do not strike me as a fool, Shimura-san," Baragan remarked, gazing absently at the elderly man with bandages in front of him. "I assume you have good reason for intruding on Naruto's property uninvited and unannounced. If I may be allowed to give my reasons for approaching in such a manner, I will leave the value of my reasons to you, Baragan Dono." Baragan studied Danzo more intently, his eyes narrowing even more. He decided he had no malicious intent and replied, "Very well, then speak." "Thank you," Danzo said with respect. "I am here to disclose to you the fullness of the truth behind the seals you released on Naruto Uzumaki-san's person that were not supposed to be there. Why does it matter? The seals should not have been put on the boy in the first place, and placing them on the boy at all was reckless at best. What you say is true, and I will not deny my role in young Naruto-san's sealing, though I had my own reasons for the seals I placed on him. You see, I only placed 2 seals on the boy. Seals that I fully intended to remove from him once I was able to successfully pull him from under Sarutobi's thumb. After a few moments, Baragan looked thoughtfully at Danzo once more and said, "Continue." Shortly after the boy's birth, Sarutobi put the appearance Genjutsu seal on him to prevent any potential Uzumaki survivors from thinking he was a true Uzumaki. He also gave him a different name from his father's so that the villagers here wouldn't connect him to his father. When the boy was 3 years old, the Kyuubi took him over and killed a mob that was beating him to death. At this point, Sarutobi put an anger suppression seal, a loyalty, and a communication with the Kyuubi on him. To be honestly, what he did was foolish. At first, I supported Sarutobi's logic, but I soon realized that his actions were motivated only by petty vengeance against the Kyuubi. He believed that subjugating Naruto and letting the villagers mistreat him in this way gave him a small amount of retribution against the fox for the death of his wife, who passed away while assisting Kushina Uzumaki in giving birth to Naruto-san. Soon after, I sneaked Naruto into my base while he was sleeping and used mental and physical hindrance seals to supposedly slow down his body and mind, but in reality, I was just putting away the advancement the boy would have made with time and his own efforts. Danzo's explanation irritated Baragan, who grunted and said, "Get to the point, Shimura." I put those seals on Naruto in the hopes that Sarutobi would become disillusioned with Naruto-san's lack of progress and abandon him. After that, I would enter his life, take him to root headquarters, and take off every seal, aside from his appearance Genjutsu seal. From him what was lost would have been immediately restored if the physical and mental growth seals had been removed, just as it did when you removed them as the son of a genius like Minato Namikaze. Naruto-san would undoubtedly be highly intelligent and would ask why, so I would have explained my motivations to him. So if nothing else, even if he couldn't trust you to care about him, he could at least trust you to be honest with him, eh? Baragan said, humming to himself. Baragan responded, "Well, it's certainly more than most in this village have given him." After Danzo nodded in agreement, "I'll give you that, Danzo-san. If you're not honest about who you are, you're nothing." Danzo nodded again, and then Baragan let go of some of the spiritual pressure and said, "So why tell me? For what reason did you initially want Naruto? And now, what do you want me or him for?" "I wanted to train Naruto to be the shinobi that he should have been. Perfect. Loyal to the village of his own accord, willing to do whatever it took to secure the village's future and further Konoha's interests. Now, I believe that in conjunction with you, he is the only man alive capable of being my legacy." When Danzo said, "Your legacy, you say?" Baragan frowned and squinted. "Yes, Naruto will inevitably become a king once you have fully assimilated with him, because you are a king and a figure of regal stature. My dream has always been for Konoha, Konoha, to be the dominant force on this continent. You, Baragan Dono, and Naruto-san are the most qualified to lead such an empire. So, you wouldn't mind if Naruto destroyed the Fire Daimyo and established his kingdom over the entire Fire Country?" Baragan said. Danzo merely scoffed, saying, "I don't care for pampered, haughty, and incompetent leaders like the current daimyo," as he was involved in Sarutobi's scheme to annex Uzushio's lands and incorporate them into Fire Country, but he couldn't do so unless an Uzumaki of the ruling family, like Naruto, allowed it to happen. To answer your question, though, I would be happy if Naruto became the new ruler and that man was eliminated. End of flashback. Everyone was taken aback by Baragan's meeting with Danzo when he returned to the seal and informed them. Although they weren't pleased that the man had applied extra seal to Naruto, they realized that it was done to thwart Sarutobi's attempts to control him, and Shoetsu had been able to discern from the man's words that he only intended to assist Naruto and had no malicious intent. However, this didn't mean that they wouldn't closely monitor him because the man was as old as Sarutobi. Now that Tsunade is the Hokage, however, anyone who had wronged Naruto was punished appropriately. In fact, a number of the academy's teachers had been fired after it was discovered that they had been accepting bribes. She even reorganized the academy so that those who weren't cut out to be frontline fighters would now be trained to be medics, and she eliminated a number of courses that had nothing to do with being a ninja. The arrogant people of the Leaf Village genuinely believed that they couldn't afford to lose the only Uchiha it had left, especially since they couldn't even extract any usable DNA from the bodies they had managed to find that night, to be used to artificially inseminate women and create more Uchiha. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, one Sasuke Uchiha, who was just as conceited and egotistical as his father Fugaku, had not yet confronted Baragan and killed himself. Jiraiya received an intriguing punishment. Since he was still required to maintain his spy network, killing him was not an option, at least not right now. Instead, Minato and Kushina created a special seal for Jiraiya that would cause him great pain whenever he engaged in perverse behavior, which was something that happened frequently. Despite all of this, Jiraiya, Sarutobi, and Tenzo, who had arrived a few days after Sarutobi was imprisoned, managed to recruit numerous ninja who were all in favor of their plan to try and regain control of the situation through Jiraiya's summoned toads relaying messages. They even attempted to recruit Kakashi, but the man was hesitant because, after all, he had greatly admired Minato and learning that the man's soul, or at least a piece of it, and spending time with Naruto. However, they proceeded with their plan to try to seal off Baragan even without Kakashi. Everyone thought it was time to finally remove Kyuubi's other half from Minato's body because Baragan would soon be absorbed into the seal. However, it couldn't really be called that because she had changed from being a Biju to something else, which would have had an impact on the purely yin Kyuubi inside Minato's body. After all, if the yang inside Naruto changed, then so would the yin inside Minato's body, and they were cautious about what her evolution would have been because it was unlikely that she would have undergone the same kind of change as the formerly yang half. Since Naruto, his parents, Shoetsu, Kyoka Suigetsu, Kyuubi, and Baragan were all inside the seal, any more would have probably caused it to burst under the strain. However, since Baragan was now mostly absorbed into Naruto, there was, in a sense, enough room inside the seal, which is why they did not do this earlier, as doing so would have caused a great imbalance with the sea. When Baragan arrived and placed his hand on Minato's body, they set off their trap. Tenzo, who had been infused with Sage Chakra thanks to Jiraiya, used a now Nature Chakra-empowered Mokuton to ensnare Baragan's limbs, and Jiraiya used this to hit him with the Gogyo Fuin right where the seal still was. Baragan's eyes turned completely red as his Rieatsu flared in an attempt to fight it. Within the seal, when the Gogyo Fuin struck, everything went to pieces instantly. Jiraiya used some of his remaining Sage Chakra, which had a negative effect on Baragan, a creature who was completely out of place in this world. This also had the unintended consequence of actually breaking down the seal and everyone inside it, meaning that everyone would perish if nothing was done quickly. "You stupid Jiraiya, damn you!" As the world inside the seal began to crumble, Minato cursed his former mentor. It was as if the sky were made of glass that was cracking. "What are we going to do? The seal is breaking." It was almost time for Naruto to regain control of his body, and with Choetsu's assistance, he would have been able to free his parents as well. He wasn't sure what they would have become when leaving his body, a Soul Reaper or a Hollow, but it didn't matter because they would still be his parents and they would have been free, he said, growing agitated. But Kushina and Minato exchanged a glance and both nodded, and Kushina sent the chains directly to the seal by channeling her chakra, which caused them to erupt from her back. "What are you doing, Mom? You will burn out and vanish from this world if you use your chakra in that way." A bewildered and now even more anxious Naruto yelled, but his father moved in front of him before he could stop her. "Naruto, I apologize, but you must allow us to do this. Please comprehend. The seal is disintegrating as a result of the nature-enhanced Gogyo Fuin," a somber Minato remarked. "Kushina's unique chakra can bind and subdue even Kyuubi, so it will be able to strengthen your seal to stop the collapse long enough for what needs to be done." "What are you discussing?" Naruto asked. Baragan, who appeared inside the seal, stated, "What he means is that our timetable will have to be moved up if we are to survive this." Naruto's eyes widened in realization after he took a moment to grasp what he meant. "What, do you mean that we're going to fuse right now? However, I believe that hurrying it would have negative consequences. Furthermore, what about the rest of us? How about my parents, Hyu, Shoetsu, and Kyoka?" With a sigh, Minato combed his hair and said, "Naruto, we discussed with Choetsu the possibility of being released from the seal and going out there with you and, eventually, your sister. To be honest with you, the problem is that it would never have succeeded even though your mother and I are both present in the seal. We are really only a small portion of who we were before. We would never have been able to survive outside of the seal as we are because there is so little of us that we could never have survived. I mean, it would have worked if your mother's souls were completely sealed in here, or if my soul hadn't been sealed inside the object I called upon to seal away the yin of Kyuubi. However, this is it for your mother and me right now." Naruto turned slowly to face his mother, who had a frown on her face and simply nodded, confirming what Minato had said. Tears were now streaming from Naruto's eyes, and he didn't even notice that Kyuubi had taken his hand in hers in an attempt to support him as best she could. Naruto looked at his father in shock, unable to believe what he had heard. When Naruto finally managed to say, "But, that's not fair," Kushina, who was now crying, said, "I know it is sweaty, and your father truly do want to be out of the seal so that we can finally be a family with your sister, as well as give everyone in Konoha a beating, but as powerful as Choetsu's powers are, they do have limits. In reality, neither she nor Minato could have survived if Minato's soul had been freed from the creature that devoured it as for her own soul. It seems that Choetsu could have been revived by using her soul fragment as a beacon. I understand that everyone is enjoying their moment, but we are running out of time because the seal is breaking down right now. Honestly, couldn't those idiots have tried a stunt like this after the seal had done its job? Naruto had advanced in his training, with time spent inside the seal increasing multiple times so he could properly learn his techniques and those of his parents, but the boy had not finished it. He was close, but not quite there now. All three of them would have to essentially shove whatever knowledge they had yet to teach him directly into his mind. If you three take too much longer with your goodbyes, then all of us will perish, said an irritated Baragan. To be honest, it seemed like those idiots were eager to pass away. Kushina and Minato exchanged irritated looks with Baragan, then went to embrace Naruto, who was now slightly taller than his father. They reluctantly released their hold on each other, and Minato and Kushina stood before him. Naruto, I know I'm not the best father out there as I've made some pretty foolish choices, but I can honestly say that I've never been more proud of anything in my life than I have been of you, said a beaming Minato. And even though your sister and I might not be there for you, I know you'll be alright. However, please give her a chance when you finally get to meet her, Naruto. I understand that you were left here and she was removed from Konoha to live safely, but please don't vent your resentment on her. Although the Uzumaki clan members are taught that family comes first, some people disapprove of children born to non-clan marriages. I wouldn't be shocked if they didn't come and take you away from here because those who share that belief blocked all other attempts by the others, Kushina pleaded, and Naruto could see that she was deeply troubled by this. It's either that, or they feel that with both you and Reina, it would lead to a power struggle over who would lead the clan as you two are twins. Even though Naruto was aware that his sister was a sensitive topic and that no one had ever brought it up, he was unable to refute his mother's assertions that some clan members would obstruct attempts to save him because they would only see him as a filthy half-blood, or because they feared a potential power struggle. Naruto sighed and said, "Okay, Mom, I'll give her a chance. However, there are still issues in Konoha that need to be resolved, so it might take some time before I can reach her location." "Thank you, son. That's all I ask." Kushina grinned at this, and she gasped as her hand started to break. "It's starting." "Then, we're running out of time. We must complete the absorption, Naruto. Even though I am aware that it is ahead of schedule, it's not like you won't see them again because, as they said, you can always find your mother's soul and release Minato's soul from whatever he's trapped inside later. Hey Gramps, before we completely fuse, how about you show those fools exactly what it means to try and mess with the King of Hollows?" laughed Naruto. Although Baragan disliked Naruto's respect by referring to the King of Hueco Mundo as Gramps, and he knew that Naruto was aware of this, he preferred the idea of exposing those idiots for who they were. Baragan exclaimed, "All right brat, you got yourself a deal. I may be going out, but at least I'll go out showing those fools what it means to challenge the God King of Hueco Mundo." Naruto felt Baragan's power pouring into him as they joined hands. However, no one saw a man observing all of this as Baragan and Naruto completed their fusion. His short, spiky hair was framed by two bandaged locks on either side of his face. His forehead protector was blank. He was wearing a light-colored kimono with a dark-colored sash holding it closed and magatama around the collar before vanishing into the light. He remarked, "Out of all my reincarnations thus far, I never would have believed something like this would happen. Well, I wonder what you're going to do with all that power, my other self." They were about to celebrate their triumph when they returned to the real world and suddenly felt a lot of pressure. Gravity itself seemed to have become more intense. Baragan roared, "You fools!" as his strength grew, shattering his wooden restraints and calling forth his axe. Those who were able to move under the intense pressure made hand signals and threw their jutsu at him, but he easily swatted them away with a single axe swing. "You thought you could bind me? Let alone seal me away, and make the boy your slave? How arrogant! You who sought to take that which was never yours, shall now witness in horror the power you tried to contain. Now rot! Arrogante!" Baragan exclaimed as the axe erupted into a dark purple and black miasma that soon engulfed his entire body. Everyone in attendance experienced a level of fear they were unaware of when it started to clear. They saw a skull wearing a lavishly adorned, jeweled crown with a chain extending downward on the left side. Rather than a young, slender man, it was wrapped in a purple cloak, and the fringes and neck area were adorned with a collar of tattered black fur. The armbands from before were still on his now skeletal hands, which now had multiple golden chains hanging from them. In the middle of his chest is a graceful pendant that resembles an eye. Overall, he had the appearance one would anticipate from the King of the Dead. He lifted his right arm, revealing a brand new axe, and said, "Now then, it's about time you ants learned your place in the world." Compared to his previous one, it is considerably thinner and darker. It features a large spike that extends outward from its center, where the now missing still eye pendant was located, and two pointed blades. The base of the spike is surrounded by 4 golden chains that reach into his cloak and fasten to the wrist bracelet. He can control it with just his right hand despite its enormous size. They drew their swords and launched an assault after realizing that their strategy had completely failed and that their fear of the creature in front of them was winning out. They barely made it a few steps before he raised his axe and swung, causing the same dark miasma to appear. When they came into contact with the stream of darkness, they started to rot away into nothing. Tenzo screamed, "Enough! Mokuton!" Smothering binding technique, as his arm changed into a tree that grew to ensnare Baragan before it broke apart before it could even reach him. Was that it? Trying to tie me up with some sticks? How feeble your minds are! Even though the wood release may be powerful, you are just a pale imitation of the original user, and even then trying to trap me would never work. At its core, your precious Mokuton is still just chakra-infused plants, and plants, like everything else, can age and die. That you would actually think that would work speaks volumes of your arrogance, or perhaps you are so afraid of my power that your fears override your common sense. Either way, it doesn't matter. I can't allow one such as you to remain alive, because even though you are just a mere any, you could later become a nuisance for Naruto or Spira. With that, the smoke-like miasma reappeared, and before Tenzo could pull his arm away, he was engulfed by it. Tenzo was the only one left alive, and Jiraiya could only watch in silent horror as he quickly passed away. When he saw that Baragan was now directly in front of him, he turned his head and took a step back. Now that she was free of the seal, Kyuubi asked, "Now then, what should we do about the perverted sage?" Kyoka Suigetsu and Choetsu stood behind her. To her astonishment, however, she felt no fear, anger, or hatred toward Jiraiya, just sadness and regret. Was it because he was aware that Sarutobi had undoubtedly failed him in his mission? No, not completely, because the sadness that radiated from him was more akin to the realization that you were going to lose something very important to you as a result of your failure. But the only source of that kind of melancholy was... Her eyes widened as she realized that even though she was free, they were still connected, so she mentally communicated her thoughts to both Baragan and Naruto. Baragan, who was still in charge for the moment, just moaned in frustration, "And here I was hoping I could just kill you and be done with it, but it appears that Kyuubi here has other plans." Kyuubi encircled Jiraiya with multiple tails before he could react, making it impossible for him to flee. "Now, it's about time we all had a little talk." Gazing into her narrow, blood-red eyes, Jiraiya nearly wished Baragan had killed her. However, Reina has also been having a difficult time back in Uzushio. She had been attempting to obtain the council, which was composed of the leaders of the different clans that had joined Uzu and escaped the bloodline purges in Kiri, such as the Yuki, some of the less vicious members of the Kaguya clan, Pakura of the Scorch release, who had founded her own clan because her Scorch ability was actually a bloodline, the Hazuka brothers Mangetsu and Suigetsu, the members of the Uchiha clan that Mikoto had saved but not herself, and the third Kage's illegitimate children. In order to help rebuild Uzu after it had been nearly destroyed during the last war, Pakura had given them secrets after Suna sold her out and joined Uzu. This allowed them to drug the man and steal his DNA, which they then used to impregnate multiple women. However, obtaining the man's DNA had not been simple. Some of them acquired the ability to use magnetism jutsu or steel release, but not all of them had received the iron sand. Even the Uchiha clan agreed that it was not a good idea to bring Naruto, or rather, the creature that was taking over his body, to Uzu at this time, despite their desire to free Naruto from the Leaf Village. After all, they were afraid that the Hollow King Baragan would exact revenge on the Uzumaki clan for abandoning Naruto there, and that his wrath might also be directed at them, since they had heard about what he was doing to the Konoha people who had wronged Naruto. That was the extent of their support for the boy, even though they had been able to leave an agent and his daughter to care for him and assist him as best they could. Nevertheless, in spite of what the purest clan members claimed, Reina still wanted to at least contact her brother. She contended that they had no chance of stopping her brother given his impending ability to corrode and deteriorate everything. Even though barrier Fuinjutsu was strong, it would only hold him back for a brief period of time before aging into nothing. She was correct, and this made everyone who had opposed saving Naruto from Konoha, much less reaching out to him, reconsider. Since no technique could last forever, they had no chance of stopping him. They didn't even want him close to Uzushio, but they couldn't stop him with his power, so they gave in and let her write her note, which their agent in Konoha could then deliver to him. Konoha. A few days later, there was a lot of activity in the village as people gathered in front of the Hokage Tower because Tsunade was going to make a special announcement about Naruto Uzumaki and Sandai Hokage Sarutobi Hiruzen. Soon after, Tsunade showed up with Naruto standing next to her, albeit in slightly different attire. His clothes were still the same as they had been when Baragan was in charge, but instead of being white, they were now burnt orange with a red spiral design and a huge red swirl on the back. The Kyuubi was now engraved on his bracelets as well. The crowd gasped when Tsunade said, "People of Konoha, you are here today because one Sarutobi Hiruzen had managed to get several ninja attacked my godson. Obviously this failed, but, with all of the other crimes Hiruzen has committed, chief among them being a gross abuse of power, child neglect, accessory to child abuse, the attempted manipulation of a clan heir to steal clan secrets and clan property, among several other crimes, his sentence is execution." Sarutobi was forced to kneel by his escort as he was carried up onto an elevated platform, with Naruto standing next to him and Baragan's axe Aragante resting on his shoulder. The sealed Aragante was raised by Naruto. "You know, monkey," Naruto remarked, glancing down at the gagged and bound former Hokage, who gave him a hateful look. Before Sarutobi knew it, a sword had run him through. This here axe was Grandpa Baragan's person weapon that he used when conquering all of Hueco Mundo. This axe has slain hundreds upon hundreds of foes, and seen many a battle. You should feel honored that you're going to be killed by such a weapon. He said it was simple looking and seemed to have red patterns on it, but Sarutobi's blood covered the blade, making them difficult to see. Leaning closer, Naruto whispered in Sarutobi's ear, "Scum like you isn't worthy of being killed by Aragante." He then took a step back and removed his sword from Sarutobi's chest, incorporating the man's soul into the weapon to prevent Sarutobi from returning as a hollow. As was possible with Choetsu in this world, Sarutobi's blood pooled around him, but he was already dead before he even hit the ground. As a result, Sarutobi Hiruzen, one of the oldest Kages still alive, was killed by the very person he was trying to control. Following Sarutobi's execution, Konoha was in a bit of turmoil. One Konohamaru, who was too young to fully comprehend the situation, attempted one of his assassinations on Naruto. It was obviously a complete failure. Asuma, Hiruzen's son, was ambivalent about the situation, and the other members of the Sarutobi clan were relieved when Naruto merely bopped the boy on the head instead of killing him for it. He loved his father as much as any child, but he also realized that his father had seriously abused his position as Hokage, even going so far as to meddle in the affairs of the Senju and Uzumaki clans. All things considered, Naruto had every right to demand more than his father's head in retaliation. Being the victim, he could have easily diminished the Sarutobi clan to a minor one. The members who desired retribution were aware that Naruto could still demand almost anything from them in exchange for Hiruzen's actions against him and the Uzumaki clan, and they would be forced to comply. However, after overcoming their initial shock, the rest of the village realized that Naruto was no longer their punching bag if the Sandaime Hokage was unable to resist him. Naturally, this made the other clans wary of Naruto because, although they clearly wanted to try to form some kind of alliance with him, it was clear that any such agreement would have to be mutually beneficial because, otherwise, trying to take advantage of him would only end in disaster. Furthermore, they weren't even certain that a powerful person like Naruto would be interested in marrying their daughters. Although Ino wasn't as horrible as Sakura Haruno, she wasn't particularly good either, and she didn't take her training as seriously as she had before. Tsunade changed the academy so that those who were actually graduating would be receiving the right training to actually survive in the harsh ninja world. For this reason, Inoichi didn't even consider the possibility that Naruto would agree to marry Ino. Like the rest of her clan, Sume Inuzuka saw Naruto as something greater than an alpha, an apex predator, a creature at the top of the food chain. The only other creature that could even pose a threat to him was Kyuubi, also known as Sienna, who was now free, and his wife. Although the Inuzuka clan as a whole and Sume respected his strength, she wasn't even certain that Naruto would consider other women in the village if he had a maid like Sienna. The only other clans in the village with female heirs with whom to potentially form an alliance with the new superpower were the Hyuga and the Kurama. Although Hiyashi had 2 daughters, he was certain that only his older daughter Hanabi had a chance of attracting Naruto's attention because he didn't think Naruto would be interested in his younger daughter Hinata. However, the Kurama saw Naruto as their chance to revitalize their clan and elevate it from a minor clan. Although some would doubt it, their heiress Yakumo possessed strong but erratic abilities in addition to a frail body. However, they were left with no choice but to hope that Naruto would marry Yakumo and prevent the extinction of their clan. However, Naruto had found the situation to be highly intriguing. He had anticipated a response from the Fire Daimyo following Sarutobi's execution because the 2 elderly men had conspired to turn him into a puppet so they could seize and pillage Uzushio's territory. Naruto is curious but not particularly worried about what the fat jerk who dared to call himself ruler is up to, since there hasn't even been a word from the capital yet. After all, aside from the monks of the Fire Temple, one of whom once held a piece of Kyuubi's chakra that was reclaimed without them knowing it because Choetsu and Sienna were able to summon the energy back to its proper location. In essence, they used Sienna as a beacon for the energy fragment inside the monk, causing it to leave his body and return to her. Though he wasn't totally sure how it worked, they didn't really care, but they had no way of knowing how agonizing it would have been for that person. The strange things that had recently occurred, however, in the form of his two new houseguests, were far worse than any of that. First, there was the issue of the Yin Kyuubi, which was becoming a little annoying since they were now two distinct entities. Neither of them wanted to use their previous name, Kurama, which was a male name, or any variation of it, claiming that was a part of their previous lives. Instead, they wanted new names to correspond with their new lives. The former Yin Kyuubi adopted the name Makui, which means malevolence. It made sense because she resembled a dark priestess in appearance and because she had somehow fused with the yamis of Kushina and Mito, who had never had to confront each other because they had never even attempted to master her chakra and had nowhere else to go, so they fused into her to top it all off. There was Makoto Uchiha, who is now an Arankar, and his own mother, Kushina. You might wonder, though, how Kushina was there. It was clear that Kushina's soul had been imprisoned inside the Uzumaki Mask Temple since Minato's soul had been trapped inside the Shinigami he summoned, and there was no sign of her soul other than the lingering energy from the mask. Thus, the Shinigami was created by using the mask to call forth the Soul Reaper and hollow energies that leaked from Baragan's crown upon their initial arrival in this world. However, they were all taken aback when Kushina was called upon in place of the hideous Shinigami. It turned out that after consuming Minato's soul, it also desired to consume Kushina's. However, Kushina had been undergoing the hollowification process and had resisted it, but it was still sufficiently hollow to consume the Shinigami and all of its souls. However, the issue arose when she effectively became it. Since Minato was dead, the summoning was completed, and Kushina was forced to retreat to whatever pocket dimension it inhabited until it was summoned once more and cut off from the outside world only because her soul fragment had returned to her. Did she know what was happening and what had happened thus far? But then the question arose: what became of Minato's soul? Given that Kushina had eaten the Shinigami, which had consumed Minato's soul, it was reasonable to assume that Minato's soul was now somewhere inside Kushina. This was assuming that, in her new state of existence as a sort of balance between Arankar and Vizard, Minato's soul had not dissolved and become a part of Kushina, as was the case when hollows ate other hollows. Therefore, if Minato's soul still existed at all, it was extremely unlikely that he could be set free. And since Minato's soul was probably absorbed into Kushina's body, they weren't sure that would even work, given that the only way to extract souls from the Shinigami was to use the mask to synchronize with it and cause it to slice open its stomach, as well as the users, to release the souls. They found solace in the knowledge that Minato would always be with them, even though they were sad that he would no longer be with them in the real world. Kushina, actually. Regarding Makoto, well, rewind, only a few days had passed since Sarutobi's execution, and they were debating their next move when Choetsu abruptly warned Naruto that a hollow was rapidly approaching Konoha. Because Choetsu was still somewhat connected to the outside world from the time she and the others were trapped inside the crown, she possessed extraordinary senses. She added that it was even high Vasto Lord class. As if that weren't enough, she had no idea what it wanted, but she could infer from her senses that it wouldn't be long before it reached Konoha, since the hollow was probably drawn to Konoha by the enormous amounts of energy that Naruto and the others possessed. They made the decision to travel far enough outside the village to limit the amount of damage that would probably result from the fight. Naruto was intrigued by the hollow when it eventually materialized. As he examined the new arrival, he realized that, aside from Grandpa Baragan, he had never encountered another hollow, much less one that had not developed into an Arankar. Even with the bone plating that all hollows had, it was clear that she was a woman and that her body was somewhat curved. She was about 5 feet 7 inches and, judging by her wings and mask, she was some kind of hollow bird, though he wasn't sure what kind. Her red eyes and the comma-like marking that hung around her neck like a necklace were what truly caught the eye. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, he sensed her anger and felt her increase her spiritual pressure. However, because of the emotion-sensing ability he acquired from Yang Kyuubi's new name, it wasn't a mindless kind of anger. Rather, it felt more like when someone was upset with you because of something you did. However, how is that possible? He had never met her before, as far as he knew, perhaps back when she was living. The hollow woman said, "You," and pulled Naruto out of his reverie with her big wings spread wide and her clawed hands by her sides, ready to strike at any time. She exclaimed, "What have you done with him? I can't sense a single trace of his signature anywhere in the village, so what did you do to him?" Then, with his eyes narrowed and his hand on his sword, Naruto said, "Whom are you talking about? I've done nothing to anyone who didn't deserve his or her fate unless you speak of me killing Sarutobi and his cohorts. Sarutobi. That treacherous wretch. Why should I care what you did to him? In fact, I'm glad he's dead. No, what I want to know is what you did with my precious Orenji Iroh no Hoshi, and tell me why I can't sense his presence anywhere inside of this damnable village. She exclaimed, becoming more irate as her Ryotsu increased. Orenji Iroh no Hoshi, an orange star. What on earth is she discussing? And why does that sound so familiar? Naruto thought. Naruto answered, I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you're talking about. You're lying. Ever since you appeared, I could barely sense his presence, and the closer I got to the village the weaker it got, until it completely vanished a few days ago. So don't you tell me you don't know anything, as there is no way that your massive spike in energy had nothing to do with his presence disappearing like that. She continued and appeared to be thinking deeply. Then she started to shake and her eyes grew wide. She said, No. You didn't, as her entire body started to shake. You did, didn't you? That's why I can't feel his energy anymore. You killed him and ate his soul, didn't you, you bastard? Why, he was so young and innocent. Why did you have to kill him? Why not any of the villagers? Hell, the entire village? Why did you have to kill my sweet and pure Orenji Iroh no Hoshi? He did nothing wrong. He did nothing to deserve being killed and eaten. She started talking to herself aloud at this point, telling herself that she should have killed the villagers and taken her orange star away instead of leaving him alone. However, that only served to further perplex Naruto. Who was she referring to? Why did he think he knew her from somewhere? Through their mental connection, Siena's voice said, I think I know why. Love, giving her permission to go on. He was abruptly transported back in time to a childhood memory. He was being held in the arms of a stunning woman with raven hair. When the memory came to him, she was grinning down at him and he was looking up into her dark eyes. He had asked her if she would always be with him, and she replied, Don't worry my little Orenji Iroh no Hoshi, I'll always look after you, no matter what. Suddenly, Naruto was back in the clearing with the hollow as the memory faded. When he recognized the hollow in front of him, a single tear trickled down his cheek. Through a whisper, Makoto, now he knew what she meant. She would have only been able to identify the energy signature of Naruto when he was human, not in his new form, so she assumed that he had eaten him as a hollow since she didn't seem to know about Baragan fusing to him. However, how did she initially turn into a hollow? The only plausible explanation was that it occurred during the massacre, and she became a hollow at that time. Did that imply, however, that she had been keeping an eye on him all along? He was not permitted to linger on this insight, though, because he instinctively raised his blade to block Makoto's claw attack after hearing Siena's mental cry of, Watch out. She cried out, her red eyes blazing with rage and tears streaming freely from her heart. You damned monster. I'll kill you. Tear open your stomach and release his soul from you, she cried. Naruto tried to say, No, you don't understand, but Makoto wouldn't listen. She grabbed his sword, pulled it away from him, and then raised her other claw to try to rip out his eyes. However, he was able to slow down her attack significantly by using his senescencia, which he acquired from Baragan. This allowed Naruto to duck beneath the attack, causing her to overextend her arm and expose herself to attack. Even though Naruto didn't want to harm her, he knew that she wouldn't listen to reason in her current state, so he made a bala with his free hand and aimed it at her stomach. She was thrown into one of the trees in the clearing by the force of the attack. Naruto had to find a way to overcome the anger and grief that were now consuming her, thinking he was dead, because he knew that such a feeble attack would only serve to stun her. However, words would be useless. In addition, there was a huge ball of black flames coming his way. Holy shit! He exclaimed as he dodged the attack with a sonido, the black flames exploding violently as they hit the trees behind him. What the devil was that? Naruto thought he was aware of the peculiar and unusual abilities of hollows, particularly Vasto Lord. But black fire of all things? He knew the attack was lethal because he could sense its power. In particular, he could see that the fire was still burning on the desolate ground. How could that have happened? It appears that things have gotten much more challenging. Those are Amaterasu's flames, unquenchable flames that will burn continuously for 7 days and nights. Only the Mangekyo Sharingan, the Sharingan's next level, is capable of using this ability. It appears that Makoto unlocked it in some way prior to her passing, and its powers carried over into her hollow form. This suggests that, although I'm not sure how it might have changed in her new form, she might very well have access to the other ability they grant, the Tsukiyomi, which traps the target in an almost unbreakable illusion. However, I can only hope that she does not possess the Susanoo, which would allow her to summon a massive ethereal warrior to fight alongside. After answering Naruto's question, Siena said, I advise you to find a way to get through to her before this gets even worse. However, Naruto was only irritated by this. That was what kind of bullshit. He could comprehend the Tsukiyomi ability because it was essentially an overpowered genjutsu. The Amaterasu's ability to create unquenchable flames that persisted for 7 days was a bit of a stretch. However, he drew the line at the ability of a pair of fucking eyeballs to summon a giant warrior that you could use in combat. Was that even possible? Given his own powers, he could age people to death in a matter of seconds. He did sound a little hypocritical, but that was only because he had absorbed a soul-eating monster from another dimension. Even if they had a connection to the Rinnegan, it was utterly absurd for a pair of unique eyes to be capable of such nonsense. To make matters worse, his senescencia couldn't be aged, so it didn't function on fire. The pure element of fire itself was beyond him, even though he could age whatever the fire was using to continue burning. The same applied to attacks based on wind, water, and lightning. They could not be aged into nothing since they were in no way physical. At least not with his current aging control. While training with his parents, Baragan discovered a significant weakness in his skill set. Haribel was one of the few hollows in Hueco Mundo who had survived and possessed such a powerful ability over water, but Baragan himself told them that any hollow with any kind of elemental ability was incredibly rare because they typically had abilities based on animals, bugs, and the like, and even then they rarely grew strong enough to pose a viable threat because they would usually be devoured. Although he had encountered a few elemental users, Baragan acknowledged that although they were uncommon, it was possible to age a specific element. Simply put, their aging process differed from his power's normal operation. He informed Naruto that he would need to undergo intensive training to learn how to age those other elements because each method was unique. Water, which evaporated, and fire, which finally extinguished itself, are the only two elements that Naruto could age. Wind and lightning were far more challenging, nearly impossible. Fighting Makoto was made even more challenging in light of that, particularly since he had doubts about her ability to control her fire. Even though he didn't like the thought of her calling forth a huge ethereal warrior, he could at least age that into nothing because it would resemble a Kido spell, which he could easily influence. Then, as Naruto watched Makoto create more flames in her hands, they grew and started to completely engulf her claws rather than being thrown as he had anticipated. And she wasn't hurt at all. He thinks that's 7 more pieces of bullshit. Even though Naruto was even more protected from his aging abilities than Baragan, he was still vulnerable to their death if he made a mistake. However, Makoto was able to wear her black flames, which were capable of burning anything, like some sort of fire armor. Goddammit, that wasn't fair. She then lunged at him, frantically attempting to strike him, but he was able to easily avoid all of her blows thanks to his senescencia. He was unable to avoid her attacks indefinitely, but what other options did he have? He didn't have the chakra chains. His mother had to control her. And that was it. She would be more than capable of being restrained by her chains. All he needed to do now was wait until they were prepared to take action after mentally giving Sienna instructions and receiving the mental equivalent of a nod in return. Which didn't last long because Makoto was attacked by terrifying apparitions created by a kui that suddenly erupted from the nearby tree line while he was preoccupied. His mother's chains emerged from all over the clearing and even a few from underground to grab her legs so she wouldn't fly off. She was soon ensnared, and Akui's apparitions vanished, becoming unnecessary. Makoto gave Naruto a severe glare as she fought to break free, and he winced, but instead, he just dug into his pocket and pulled out his clenched fist close to her face. Makoto let out a tiny gasp as he opened his palm. He turned it over so she could see the other side, which was a star with orange gems set at each point. It was a small oval pendant that was hanging from a chain and had a raven engraved on it. Do you remember this? You gave this to me. To symbolize our friendship, you told me you had this specially crafted, so that even when you weren't with me, I would always have this with me, so I wouldn't always be alone. Do you remember, Makoto? Replied Naruto. Makoto was unable to speak and could only gaze at the pendant. Then, free from her self-induced anger and grief, she gazed into Naruto's eyes and saw that although they had changed color, they were still the same eyes she had always known. When she realized that she had falsely attacked Naruto, she lost the strength in her legs and fell to the ground, kneeling with her upper body bent forward so that she was staring directly at the ground. Tears were now streaming from her eyes as she repeatedly said, "I'm sorry," in silence. When Naruto nodded, his mother released her chakra chains. Makoto jumped a little when Naruto knelt down and put his hand on her shoulder. He said, "Makoto, please, look at me." At first, it appeared as though she would remain where she was, but she gradually lifted her head off the ground to face Naruto. She attempted to say, "Naruto, please forgive," before Naruto shocked her by embracing her tightly. "No, don't be sorry, never be sorry. You were only worried about me and didn't know what had happened. I was so sad when I heard about the massacre, and when I had heard there had been a survivor, I had a small bit of hope that it was you." only to find out that it was that little bastard Sasuke. But now I know that you were never really gone, I just couldn't see you, and now, I'm not going to let you disappear on me ever again, Naruto said. Holding her tightly, Makoto was so surprised that Naruto wasn't even angry with her that she was unable to speak. Rather, she buried her face in his shoulder and gave him a hug in return. Not only had her son been reunited with someone significant to him in the most unlikely of circumstances, but it also happened to be a close friend of hers, which made Kushina smile. Although she was relieved to see her alive, she had also been saddened when she first learned of her dear friend's passing. You see the idea, but it's not really alive. However, Sienna could only sigh in annoyance, not in anger or anything else, because she was glad her husband was back with someone significant to him. She was also fairly certain that, given Naruto's advanced age, their relationship might develop into a romantic one, since the age gap would no longer be a barrier. Since Akui was essentially her twin sister, she didn't count and she had no problem with her joining in, but it would take time because her sister didn't feel the same way she did about Naruto. Akui only received fragments of memories from Sienna, but she felt it would only be a matter of time before she ended up falling in love with him the way she did. In all honesty, she thought she would have had more time to have Naruto to herself before other love interests started showing up. They were essentially the same being, after all. End of flashback. However, the issue of how they were going to explain Makoto's existence arose after they managed to get her to the Uzumaki clan compound and had Choetsu transform her into an Arankar. Even though Tsunade had reclaimed all the authority that the civilians had taken away from the Hokage position, there was still the issue of people identifying her, particularly that little annoyance known as Sasuke. However, Makoto surprised them all by saying, "Sasuke? Who's that?" when they brought up Sasuke for some odd reason. Why couldn't she recall Sasuke but Naruto? They told Makoto that he was her son because they thought she might have lost some of her memories when she turned hollow. However, when Kushina mentioned how much he resembled Fugaku, Makoto's face instantly darkened and she said, "If that boy is anything like Fugaku, son or not, I want nothing to do with him." Seeing how serious she was, they stopped there. Even though Sienna suspected there was more to it than that, she chose to ignore it for the time being. Nevertheless, Naruto still had to deal with one more pressing issue. When a strange Anbu showed up at his house late one night and claimed to have a message for him from his sister, Reina, he wasn't even sure where to begin because he didn't know where she was. Instantly suspicious, Naruto questioned how he could possibly be trusted. With a laugh, the Anbu took off his mask to reveal that he was Tuchi, the ramen chef. When Tuchi revealed that he was a spy from Uzushio sent to protect Naruto, Naruto was completely taken aback. Tuchi said he would return to the ramen stand and wait for Naruto's response after his mind was sufficiently blown. They all went back inside, read the letter, and then looked expectantly at Naruto. Kushina was the only one of them who truly wanted to travel to Uzushio. Makoto was only somewhat interested because she wanted to help her friend get back in touch with her family, and Sienna was only concerned because the Uzumaki clan members who survived, along with all the other clans there, would be very strong allies. Thus, in a matter of seconds, Naruto had made up his mind and his decision was evident. Naruto remarked, "Looks like we're going to Uzushio." Days after Naruto received the letter, which came from his sister, no less. Naturally, he made the decision to visit his estranged sister in Uzushio and learn why she had been taken alone rather than with him. He was aware that his sister wasn't to blame, but was there really just one person tasked with keeping an eye on him? It doesn't matter how Tuchi initially contacted the Uzumaki clan to accept such a mission. He was now on a boat that was just big enough to accommodate Makoto, Kyoka, Kushina, Choetsu, Sienna, Akui, and Naruto. For several days now, they had been out at sea. Putting that aside, though, he was very anxious, and why wouldn't he be? After all this time, this would be his first encounter with his sister. In addition, he would be getting to know every surviving member of the Uzumaki clan. He wondered what they would be like. He only had what his mother could recall about Uzushio, which wasn't much given that she was compelled to leave her home and travel to Konoha in order to be Kyuubi's, or rather, Sienna and Akui's, Jinchuriki when they were both one being. Speaking of his mother, she was actually quite pleased to be returning home after all this time and was looking forward to seeing some old friends as well as finally holding her daughter. All he could do was wish he shared her joy over this. He felt his hand being held and turned to see Sienna holding it. She smiled reassuringly at him, and he smiled back. Their relationship had progressed to the point where Naruto could marry her, even though they had not been able to do so legally. The only issue was that there was not enough time for a formal ceremony because of everything that was going on. In addition, she had been coerced into attacking Konoha all those years ago by that masked bastard. Although it was extremely unlikely that he would be able to control her at this point, The Sharingan would no longer be able to do so once she changed into her new form and was no longer a Biju but rather a real, flesh and blood creature. However, Naruto hoped that he would be able to handle this visit to Uzushio swiftly so that he could finally wed Sienna, who had been bugging him about it. He assumed it was because she was now a living person and had the mindset that she wanted to be his first and the alpha woman. If he had other women, he guessed it had something to do with her being partially animal, but he didn't fully understand it or why she was even allowing him to have other women. Kushina exclaimed, "Look, it's Uzushio," with excitement indeed. They could now see the island nation of Uzu in the distance. "Are you ready for this, Naruto? I can sense a great many people, and not many of them are Uzumaki. There isn't any signs of fighting, meaning that the Uzumaki clan took in a great many people, which is strange, as I remember from when I was sealed inside of Mito that the more xenophobic and purist Uzumaki would have never allowed such a thing during her time. I guess that with how they were nearly wiped out, they had no choice but to let in other people. Can't imagine how they feel about Reina, seeing as she's only half Uzumaki," Sienna replied. He gave her a nod and returned his focus to the island. He had to worry about something else now. Purists who were pretentious. Fantastic. Uzushio Reina had been waiting impatiently for her brother's response from the spy in Konoha, and when she learned he would be attending with their mother, no less, she was overjoyed. She had heard that her soul was imprisoned inside the seal and could not be released, so at first she didn't understand how this was even possible. She had another reason for her brother to arrive as soon as possible, though, and she didn't think he would lie to her about something like this. However, she saw that the purist faction was behaving oddly. Or more than normal. Anyway, the fact that they had initially approved her brother's visit to Uzushio surprised her greatly. Technically, she was meant to be the head of the clan and have the last word on everything, but the purist faction was able to prevent her from taking full control of the clan until she was an adult, which meant she had to wait until she was 18. She was also aware that they didn't like her because she was half-blood. The purists' hatred of having any other bloodlines taint the sanctity of their own blood and soul was well known. That thought made her scoff. In her head, purists held to the beliefs of the Clan Wars era, which prioritized clans over all other considerations. She knew better than to believe them when they said that the village era had been decided far too soon. Old fools who haven't changed their stupid ways. The clan is coming to what? The elderly idiots were even making an effort to agitate the other clans. Without them, they wouldn't even be able to protect themselves from one of the smaller villages, didn't they realize? Especially one of the big ones. Although there were only a few other locations that could potentially attack them, many bloodline users who had fled the genocides had come to Uzu because Kiri was in a civil war. All she could hope was that they wouldn't try anything to harm her brother. She had, after all, heard about his adventures in Konoha and the abilities he had acquired. Since it was primarily the purists' fault that Naruto had been left there, it wouldn't be good if they ended up turning against her brother, especially since he likely didn't think highly of them in the first place. At that, she couldn't help but clench her fists while she was being taken away. Her own biological brother had to be left alone. She was sickened by it and felt a little ashamed of her own people for allowing it to occur. A voice behind her said, "My lady, our scouts have spotted the vessel that undoubtedly has our guests." Reina recognized the speaker right away. How much she hated whoever owned that voice. She turned around and saw Freed Uzumaki, the purists' current leader. With his fair skin, red eyes, and short red hair, he was a pretty handsome man. But that was all. Freed spoke in an extremely impolite manner and was a very vulgar man. In addition, the man was a terrible pervert who persistently harassed clan women in an attempt to get them to have sex with him. In addition, he was a battle maniac who had no problem gravely harming anyone he sparred against. His pure white robes and silver Uzumaki necklace gave him the appearance of an elderly religious fanatic. Reina said, "Thank you, Freed, you may go now." Freed bowed, grinning, and walked away with a concealed frown. I'll never understand how someone like him became the leader of the purist faction, let alone any position of authority. Those purists must be losing their minds, more so than I first thought. Reina was thinking to herself. She sincerely hoped they didn't cause any issues because she didn't think they could stop her brother if he became sufficiently irate. Naruto and Kushina were taken to the Uzumaki clan's council chambers as soon as Naruto and company arrived in the village, while the others were informed that they would have to wait until they were finished. Naturally, Sienna was upset about this, but Naruto quickly made her feel better by promising to make things right. When he and Kushina arrived, they were met by a number of Uzumaki members seated in a semicircle, all of them staring at them. However, when they noticed a young girl in the center, their eyes widened. Her dark orange and red hair was in a braid that reached her mid-back, and she stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. She wore a traditional kimono that did little to conceal her well-developed body and C-cup breasts. She had fair skin and bright amethyst eyes. However, despite her appearance, Naruto and Kushina could sense a certain attraction simply by gazing at her. They immediately recognized this young woman as Reina. Reina began, "It's a pleasure to finally meet my missing family, brother, mother," but was interrupted when Kushina, who was sobbing quietly, pulled her into a tight embrace, stunned to find her mother, who had died, hugging her. Reina was unable to speak once she had recovered from her shock. Reina hugged her mother back and held her close. Naruto was actually feeling a little uncomfortable during this. Naruto was aware that his mother was ecstatic to see her daughter alive and well, but it was different for him. He didn't feel anything for her. Even though he knew she was family, even though she was his sister, she was essentially a stranger to him because they had spent their entire lives apart. However, he had promised his mother that he would give her a chance, and he was going to fulfill that promise, assuming, of course, that the meeting went smoothly and nothing went wrong. A few more seconds passed before mother and daughter finally separated, and Kushina started examining Reina. "Just look at how beautiful my little girl has become. You got my eyes and hair, though it looks like a bit of your father's is there as well. You must have to fend off quite a few suitors, eh?" Kushina said to a now smiling Reina. Embarrassed that her mother was acting in this way at this particular moment, Reina said, "Mother, please." She was more than happy to welcome her once dead mother back into the world, even though it would take some getting used to. None of the Uzumaki clan's members were actually that close to her, despite the fact that she was officially among family. In addition to being brought up to be a proper clan leader, she ended up missing out on a lot of things. However, she was optimistic that they could reunite as a family now that her mother had been brought back to life and her estranged brother was here. One of the older Uzumaki in the room, Saito, stated, "Yes, if you could please hold off on any more public displays of affections, we would all like to get this meeting underway. While we understand that you are both happy to see each other, there are more pressing matters that need to be dealt with." It was clear from his pale red hair that he was actually turning white from age. He and every other council member wore a plain red kimono with their clan's spiral on the sleeves and back. Everyone in the room perspired a little as Kushina glared at him and unintentionally released some of her spiritual pressure. "Fine then, but after this meeting, I will be spending some quality time with my daughter, me and my son both," said Kushina, as she went back and stood next to Naruto. Another council member, a woman who looked to be in her 30s, said, "Now then, I'm sure that the two of you have realized that the letter was sent just for a social call." The council members all flinched at the tone of Naruto's voice as he said, "Yes, I am even more so that fact as to what your explanation is as to why my sister was taken from Konoha, and I was left to rot within its walls and suffer up until a few months ago. From what my mother has told me, the Uzumaki believed in family above all else, and believed that no member should be left behind, so why was I?" He knew it was a low blow saying that, but it was the truth. There are no words that can describe how ashamed we all are that we were unable to do much of anything to help you. But please try to understand that when Lady Reina was taken from Konoha, we simply did not have enough people there to take you as well. We had only sent a small force to try and get in touch with Kushina and see if she could discreetly find any way of helping us, as it would have been too dangerous to make any moves in the open, lest our enemies seek to finish us off. Unfortunately, the team sent came exactly when the Kyuubi attacked, and by the time the beast had been sealed, Konoha's ninjas were already swarming the area, leaving us with no chance to take you as well, or even take Kushina's body so she could be given a proper Uzumaki burial. Things had only gotten worse, as when the team had returned to Uzushio and shown Lady Reina to the council, the purest faction had been outraged that they had brought back, and I am ashamed to say this, a filthy half-blood, back, said Saito Uzumaki, bowing his head slightly in shame that some of the Uzumaki clan would dare say something like that. To be honest, he believed that in the state the clan was in right now, finding any Uzumaki, regardless if they be pure or not, should be welcomed with open arms, not met with scorn and hatred. Angry that someone would dare refer to her child as such, Kushina exclaimed, "What, you seriously mean to tell me that the purest faction is still around? I thought that they had already been dealt with, or at the very least they would have all been killed off during the war." "Yes, you're not the only one, but apparently when we came under attack, several of them had hidden and stayed out of the fighting. When the battle was over, and things had calmed down enough that their actions could be called into question, they simply said that if any Uzumaki should have survived the battle, it should have been them," said Dai Uzumaki, and like his name he too was a rather large man, and could have easily been confused with a member of the Akamichi clan if one were to compare. How disgusting. So not only do they look down on those who are not pure-blooded, they are also so pathetic that they would not fight alongside their family for survival, and would instead hide like cowards and let others die so they may live, said a disgusted Naruto. Yes, while the purists embody the absolute worst of our clan, we cannot simply get rid of them as they are still family, as much as we would all want to, said Takumi Uzumaki, who was the exact opposite of Dai, in that he was rather skinny. The council's oldest member, a man whose hair was entirely gray with only a few slivers of red remaining, who had lived a very long time, said, and they are also the reason why you were left in Konoha to suffer for all those years. But the others gave him a startled look, and don't any of you try to say anything about it. You all know it's true, and while we have no physical proof, everyone here knows how much the purist faction despise Lady Reina, regardless of the fact that she is Lady Kushina's child, and a member of the ruling family. Hell, they don't even like the fact that we've taken in all of these refugees from the Kiri Civil War, and that girl that was betrayed by Suna, Pakura. The mere thought of us rescuing Naruto, who in their eyes is another disgusting half-blood, was something they no doubt hated, and tried everything within their power to stop. As such, I must warn you, Lord Naruto, that while many of us are glad to see you here where you should have been from the beginning, the purist faction is anything but glad to see you here, and I wouldn't be surprised if they attempted something, said the elder. Many of the council members were captured and bound in place when dozens of chains glowing with basic blue chakra suddenly erupted from the chamber floor. Then a smirking Freed entered the chamber through the calmly opened door. He said, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I must say that I'm deeply disappointed to have not received an invitation to such an intriguing meeting of the council. After all, shouldn't those of all branches and factions of our clan be invited to these things?" 10 additional members intervened, half of whom produced the legendary chakra chains from behind their backs. Specifically, one of them used all of their chains to ensnare Naruto and Kushina, with the latter glaring at Freed and the former standing calmly. The purist member holding Naruto and Kushina attempted to remove them from the chamber as he snapped his fingers, saying, "I believe we must keep to our ancestral teachings and remove this filth from our beloved chamber." But neither of them moved an inch. Rather, the chain rusted and broke apart in front of their eyes as Naruto coolly rolled his shoulders, popping them both and causing the chains to fall to the ground and vanish into thin air. Freed was annoyed when Naruto smirked and said, "Oh really? You're going to remove me? And how are you going to do that again? You think I didn't have a plan B, brat?" he questioned as the purist members without chakra chains swiftly produced seal tags, built a barrier of pure chakra around Naruto, and started to gradually contract in an attempt to crush him into dust. He went on, his eyes crazed, "Try to scream as loud as possible. It really excites me to hear those who I target suffer." "Is that it?" asked Naruto, not even concerned that the barrier he was in was gradually getting closer to him. "Because to be honest with you, this is quite pathetic. I mean, there is nothing about you to be afraid of. I can clearly sense that you don't possess the chakra necessary to even use the chakra chains in any form, so you have others doing that for you. Hell, your chakra is barely that of a Jonin, or rather your level is more of a special Jonin." Freed snarled and swore, "You insignificant little," but he was interrupted when the barrier, like the chains before it, started to deteriorate and turn drab until it finally shattered like shattered glass. A bead of sweat trickled from his brow in increasing concern, and his eyes widened in surprise in an attempt to remove the impure Uzumaki. He drew a kunai with a seal tag and gave him a fierce glare. "You think you've stopped me? This is merely the beginning. This village, this clan, this country will be mine. No longer will we associate with filth like you and your whore mother and sister," he said with a lecherous grin. Well, maybe they could be useful. After all, what better way for a half-breed to serve their betters than to service them whenever they wish? A horrifying aura swept through the room as Freed finished, and everyone who wasn't prepared for it was pushed to the ground by a tremendous pressure. Raising his hand, which was now covered in an odd black substance, Naruto casually waved it in front of him. The black substance left his hand when he struck the chains, quickly dissolving them as well. Now that everyone was free, Naruto approached Freed slowly, rooting him there with the majority of his spiritual pressure. The other purists who had previously used the chakra chains jumped out to attack Naruto upon realizing this, but they were ensnared in the respira he had summoned, which aged them into nothing. "You," Naruto uttered as he stood directly in front of Freed. "You disgusting little worm, did you honestly think that a pathetically weak creature like yourself was fit to rule? Or even had the strength for it? I can clearly see in your eyes that you crave for battle, but do not have the strength to win your own battles. That's why you had those other Uzumaki bind the others, as you knew that you had no chance on your own. But to make things worse, you actually had the audacity to say that you would have my own mother and sister be nothing more than playthings for their betters. You insolent ant!" Naruto screamed, and the spiritual pressure had now exponentially, causing the entire space to buckle the pressure. "You, who believed yourself to be worthy of ruling, to be a king, are no better than an ant. No, you are less than an ant. You're not even worthy of being the dirt beneath my feet, or even the worms beneath that," said a furious Naruto. Sensing that Naruto had increased his power, Sienna and the others had now stormed through the door and witnessed Fried trembling before him like a terrified child. "Well then, since you seem to want the power of a king so badly, how about I give you a glimpse of the power of a king who had ruled uncontested for thousands of years? Now then, rot and die, Respira." Naruto then unleashed the horrific miasma that had killed the other purists, but it did so at an excruciatingly slow pace that anyone could have avoided. However, because Naruto maintained his spiritual pressure, Fried was left with no choice but to watch as his demise approached. This power, how is that brat able to have such power? As his end drew nearer, he thought desperately, is this what it's like to be perceived as weak, worthless, or nothing at all? Fried was eventually overtaken by the miasma of death after a short while. It vanished in a matter of seconds, leaving a sizable hole in the floor where Fried had been. Naruto turned to a council that was now wide-eyed as he exerted spiritual pressure. "Well, now that I've taken care of the intrusion on our meeting, shall we continue?" replied Naruto. After a while, everything had subsided enough that the meeting could go on without any more interruptions. Since some of the Kiri people believed that Yagura had arrived and that the energy belonged to the Biju inside of him, Naruto's power had sent everyone in the village into a bit of a frenzy. Reina, however, was able to calm them down by merely stating that the Uzumaki clan's purist faction had attempted to stage a coup but had been thwarted before they could really do anything, and that all other members had been apprehended and were awaiting execution. Following that brief period of excitement, Naruto and his group met with the various clans and explored Uzushio for a few days. Many of the Uchiha members almost had a heart attack when they saw Makoto walking around, which made Naruto laugh a lot. He even got to catch up with some of the Uchiha that he had been friends with before Makoto managed to get them out before the slaughter started. Some of the older Uzumaki clan members who knew Kushina prior to her transfer to Konoha experienced a similar situation. Even so, it was interesting to meet some of his relatives, such as his uncle Shanks, who surprised him by being married to Pakura of the Scorch Release, the hero of Suna. She had apparently been betrayed by Suna, but she was discovered and returned by an Uzumaki patrol. She had revealed crucial information about Suna as payback, which enabled them to enter covertly and steal some of the third Cage's DNA, which they then used to impregnate a number of willing women in order to create their own clan of Iron Sand users. It turns out that the Cage's Iron Sand ability wasn't very stable, so some of the offspring born from his DNA received Steel Release, while others received Magnetic Release. But that was a tale for another time, as Naruto got to meet his cousins, Pakura and Shank's children, Rias and Sirzex, both whom had inherited their mother's Scorch Release. However, given that he referred to her as Rias Tan, and behaved more like a dork when Rias was around, Sirzex oddly appeared to be some sort of Siscon. However, it appeared that Sirzex's fiancée, Grafia Yuki, who, in contrast to the majority of her clansmen, had white hair rather than black, was able to control the strange man for the most part. Even though Choetsu wasn't the most outgoing person, Sienna dragged her along to experience the different cultures of the various clans, as she put it. However, Sienna mostly ended up eating all the various foods that each clan produced because she enjoyed trying out new foods and flavors now that she had a real body. Even so, Choetsu was pleased to be a part of the celebrations despite her dark appearance. Akui was actually well liked by the clansmen. She was still quite friendly with people, even though she came across as much more direct than anyone else. Kyoka Suigetsu was actually pretty shy, which wasn't all that surprising given her background and the decades she spent with Choetsu alone before Naruto ascended to the throne. However, because of her ability to create illusions, she was a big hit with the children from different clans, who thought she was a princess because of the way she was dressed. But eventually, their fun had come to an end, as Choetsu had received word from Tsunade about needing their help with a mission that had gone wrong. She accomplished this by altering the crystal ball that gave the user the ability to see anything in the Leaf Village. They then connected it to a tiny jewel to enable two-way communication, and they even made a screen that projected the people on the other end. However, it turned out that a group had been dispatched to Wave on a covert mission to safeguard a bridge builder. However, it was much more than initially anticipated because Momochi Zabuza and the Demon Brothers showed up. Since he belonged to the strongest generation of the Seven Swordsmen of the Mist, Kushina was able to recognize the name. However, the clans that had fled Kiri were quite upset when the name was spoken out loud. It turns out that Zabuza's attempt to kill Yagura was a ruse to free and escape many of the bloodline users who had been taken prisoner. Thus, they pleaded with Naruto, knowing how strong he was from the power he let loose a few days ago, to not kill the man. Naruto cooperated with their request despite knowing that, despite Zabuza's strength, the man had little to no chance of even scratching him. After completing that, Naruto's group prepared to depart for Wave. However, just before Naruto boarded the boat, Reina stopped him before they could depart. "What is it, Reina?" Naruto inquired. Reina, however, did not say anything, and stood there fidgeting with her hands, and looking downward. Glancing up at him slowly, she stood on her tiptoes and planted a kiss on Naruto's cheek. Otherwise, she would have slipped and unintentionally kissed Naruto on the lips if the docks hadn't been damp. Neither of them withdrew from the kiss at first because they were both shocked by this. They only regained their senses when Choetsu yelled in irritation, "Naruto, I know that Sienna gave you permission to have other women, but I don't believe now is the time to start." Their minds restarted as a result, and they realized they were still kissing and retreated from one another. "What was that for?" a humiliated Naruto asked. She trailed off, blushing horribly. "I only meant to give you a kiss on the cheek for good luck. But then I wound up slipping on the docks and we. Hey now. I know that I told you both that I want grandbabies, but not this soon," teased Kushina, not able to pass up the opportunity. Her children attempted to refute her claims as they gazed at her, both of them redder than before. Kyoka Suigetsu said, mentally sighing at how much like children the others occasionally acted, "Kushina, that's enough. We really don't have any time to waste, and must be going." Naruto turned back to Reina and took a deep breath to relax. Well, I guess I'll be seeing you then. Now that I've actually been here, I can open a Garganta and be here in mere moments if you need me, and we've also set up a communication sphere like the one Choetsu has if you have something important, or just want to talk to me or mom." Still a little red, Reina nodded slowly. When he blushed a little, she quickly added, "I don't mean in that way. I just mean to get to know each other better, and stuff." While still blushing, "And when you do come back, do you think it would be possible if the two of us could spend some time together, alone?" Naruto chuckles uncomfortably as he stepped onto the ship. Naruto said, "It's okay, I understand. Well, it's time for me to go. Bye for now, Reina." Reina touched her lips, still feeling the warmth from her brother's kiss, and said, "Bye Naruto." She was already missing her mother and Naruto as she watched the boat take off. "Oh, I really hope they visit us soon." For the past 3 days, Naruto and his companions had traveled to Wave Country in response to a request from the former Kiri clans, as well as to assist the team sent to guard a bridge builder. To avoid killing Zabuza, Momochi and anyone under him. Whether he was a 7 swordsman or not, he could easily crush Zabuza like a bug and had no real obligation to comply with their request. However, despite his blood-stained reputation, Zabuza had attempted to save these impoverished people from execution because their former cage considered them to be abominations and condemned all of them, men, women, and children, for slaughter. Naruto could respect the man for that, if nothing else. Even though he had little chance of succeeding in his attempt to kill someone much stronger than himself, he went ahead and did it to allow the bloodline users to get away. Naruto would soon learn enough when he confronted the man, even though he had no idea what the man was doing in Wave and not with the resistance he had heard about in Kiri. When he got to Wave, hopefully he wouldn't have to rough him up too much. He was fairly certain that a fight would inevitably occur because, although he would prefer to avoid one, it appeared that Zabuza was most likely under contract, so he had to honor it. But he couldn't help but blush when he thought about his time in Uzu. It had been odd, but pleasant, that unintentional kiss with his estranged sister. Additionally, his mother's statement that she wanted grandchildren did not help at the time. In relation to her, he was also unsure of how he felt about her. Being with his parents for those months while confined to the seal had been amazing and had filled the void in his heart that yearned for parental love. After only a few short months of spending time with them inside the seal, he had to say goodbye, which was heartbreaking. But now that she had eaten the creature the Shiki Fuin had summoned and harnessed its power for herself, he had somehow succeeded in bringing her back into his life. Unfortunately, his father Minato's soul was among them, so there was little possibility that he would be brought back to this world. And now that she was, he was having trouble understanding the new emotions he was experiencing. He couldn't deny that he thought his mother was stunning, but for some reason, she was even more so now than when he first met her inside the seal. He didn't know who else to confide in, so he had told Sienna about his odd feelings for Kushina some time ago. Her advice didn't do much to improve his circumstances. It seems that he found it difficult to accept Kushina as his mother and not just a woman because he had spent so much of his childhood alone. She asked Naruto how he felt when he saw her and Minato together back in the seal. Naturally, Naruto didn't want to believe her because this was his mother. Then he gave it some thought. Although he loved his father as any child would, he had to acknowledge that he secretly detested him for his utter ignorance in choosing to put his trust in the village. In addition, he believed that he was not deserving of his mother. This resulted from his inability to understand how they actually got together after learning the whole story. Yes, his father prevented his mother from being abducted, but that sounded more like feelings that were created solely as a result of that event and weren't truly genuine. Furthermore, Minato had not even attempted to locate the Uzumaki clan when he was appointed Hokage, even though Minato had no way of knowing that the clan had truly survived and that everyone, with the exception of a few stragglers in hiding, was now back in Uzu. The fact remained that he did nothing about them, not even asking the super spy Jiraiya to use his network to find them. Minato had married Kushina Uzumaki, a clan member, for crying out loud. How could he expect her to adopt his name? There was a sort of rule that you were supposed to take on the last name of the person you were marrying if they were part of a clan because you were marrying into that person's clan. Since Minato was a nameless orphan with the last name Namikaze for whatever reason, he had no right to make Kushina take his last name when he should have taken hers, and by refusing to adopt the Uzumaki clan name and forcing Kushina to give it up for his, Minato essentially spat on and disrespected the name. To be honest, he had no idea why his mother had consented to this, but it was irrelevant now. Naruto now had an option, though he had two options with Minato out of the picture and his emotions as they were. Keep things as they were, bury his feelings for Kushina in his heart, and carry on with their mother-son bond. Alternatively, he could try to develop a more romantic relationship with her by acting on his new feelings. However, there were issues with both choices in addition to being tormented by what-ifs for not acting on his emotions. Choosing the first option would leave his mother alone for the remainder of her practically eternal life because he strongly doubted that any other man would ever be able to get close to her. On the other hand, if he pursued his feelings for her, he ran the risk of ruining their relationship entirely, which would also cause him great pain. However, he was aware that their mother-son relationship was already tense. It was challenging and uncomfortable, primarily because he had never had a parent before, and if he was being completely honest with himself, he couldn't even consider Kushina to be his mother. It's true that she's a distant relative you've never met before, but Naruto couldn't truly see her as his mother without the emotional connection that only occurs between a parent and their child when they are young. He was sorry to have reached this conclusion, but it was the reality, and he sensed, somehow, that Kushina shared his sentiments. He sighed and returned his attention to the task at hand, putting aside his perplexing feelings for his mother. They would soon arrive at Wave, and Siena's negative emotion sense indicated that Wave was experiencing a lot of negative emotions. Not just the human kind, either. She sensed something that wasn't human there, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It was a hollow. Most likely the truth is that Makoto is a hollow, so it would make sense that there were other hollows out there as well, even though they didn't want to consider that possibility, and it would be shocking if they didn't encounter any hollows when they arrived, since Wave was essentially overcome by negative feelings of all kinds. Therefore, it was crucial to reach Wave before the hollow or hollows ate the team that was already there or any of the Wave residents. However, the likelihood of anything even approaching the level of an Ajuka's level hollow was minimal. Shoetsu's emotionless voice said, "Naruto, are you alright? You've been strangely quiet the entire voyage." Naruto turned to face her and wondered about her. Despite everyone's best efforts, she had little understanding of emotions, even though she had chosen a beautiful and voluptuous body. Hell, not even Kyoka Suigetsu, who had spent the most time with her, could make her twitch in the slightest. However, it's not really surprising that she didn't express any emotions given that the only people she interacted with were the insane man who first made her and that cunning piece of shit who only used her. With a soft sea breeze caressing his face, he turned his head back to the vast ocean and said, "Sorry about that, I have a lot on my mind." She moved to stand next to him and said, "I would imagine, after all, a few months ago, you were just a simply human being manipulated by people you thought you could trust, and now, your former human existence has ended, and have now everything you could want: a family you never knew you had, the power to get your justice on those who have wronged you, and a fiancé in Siena. Yet for some reason the two of you had not copulated your relationship." Shoetsu replied with a rage. "Shoetsu? Me and Siena agreed that we would wait until we were properly married," Naruto exclaimed in embarrassment. Shoetsu gave him a raised eyebrow. "Really? Because I would have thought you, essentially the lost prince of Uzushio returning home, as well as stopping the attempted coup by the purist faction, would have made a great time for the two of you to get married," she responded. Naruto froze at this. She was correct, it would have been the ideal moment to wed her. Because of the possible hollow nest there, as well as the pledge he made to the clans back in Uzu to not kill Zabuza and anyone who was working with him, the mission to Wave would now be even longer. There was also the problem of the man known as Gato, who had been informed by the Uzushio spy network about the dishonest shipping tycoon who had attempted to take over their island, presumably believing it to be abandoned, and steal whatever was still valuable. He had stopped sending men to the island after they had so far succeeded in convincing him that a huge sea monster was prowling around the island. However, they learned that Gato was involved in almost every aspect of the criminal underworld from the men they had apprehended. Even though Naruto would love to kill the man and destroy his soul, the issue was that if he did, someone else would take his place in the company and they wouldn't have accomplished anything. Thus, when Naruto learned of all of this, he informed Tsunade, who informed them that she would send someone who could extract the information from him. This would allow them to take over what was still usable and cripple his criminal empire. Therefore, in addition to saving the entire country from a dishonest businessman and hollow infestation, the criminal underworld also needed to be severely damaged. Too much was at risk to make a mistake. They would also have to wait for the backup from Konoha to reach Wave because no one on the ship possessed the skills needed to extract information from Gato without accidentally killing him or burning his brain. He sighed in response. His expression darkened as he remarked, "I guess you're right, and with the clusterfuck in Wave, she'll have to wait even longer before we can. All I want is to show her how important she is to me, and how much I do love her, but there is just so much other shit that keeps getting in the way, not to mention," he continued with a scowl on his face. "The man who forced her to attack all those years ago, correct? He is still out there, and is still a threat back during that time. Even sealed as I was, I could sense the continuous distortions in space and time caused not only by your father, and of the masked man. Truly, for the Sharingan to have such an ability is dangerous, and given what Makoto has displayed with her hollow variation of them, who knows what other kinds of abilities he has as well as what modifications he may have had done to himself. After all, Orochimaru is known for his experiments, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for the masked man to have gotten the snake's help to make himself stronger." Shoetsu nodded in agreement. With Orochimaru on the loose, it was impossible to know what other powers the man possessed with his Sharingan or what experiments he might have conducted to increase his power. Not to mention that while she was sealed, Shoetsu's power could have even affected him or anyone else in the elemental nations because she had no way of controlling them or preventing them from affecting others, as Makoto did when she awakened her Mangekyo Sharingan and used it to save the innocent clan member or her later transformation into a hollow. Akui, Kyoka, Kushina, Makoto, and Naruto turned to face Sienna as she said, "While that may be true, we're all standing beside you, Koi. So you don't have to worry so much. After all, it's a wife's duty to stand beside her husband no matter what, right?" "She's right, Naruto. We're all here and ready to help. Besides, most of us want our pound of flesh from that masked bastard, so don't think you're going to be facing him alone," Kushina replied. Receiving nods from everyone at this, Naruto grinned broadly. Makoto winked at Naruto, making him blush, and said, "But Sienna, the two of you haven't tied the knot quite yet, dear. If you don't hurry, someone else will snatch Naruto before you do." In fact, I wouldn't mind taking a shot. Naruto had another complex topic to deal with. Having to deal with an extremely mature woman who was clearly showing her affection for him. Even though he was in love with Sienna, she had no prior experience with romantic matters and could only draw conclusions from the few memories she had of her previous hosts, Mito and Kushina. Although she had been stuck in a loveless marriage with Fugaku and made sure the man never touched her, Makoto was a woman who knew how to play the game. Despite this, she was still able to manipulate Naruto, who had no defense against Makoto's overt advances. Sienna glared at Makoto and said, "Back off, bird brain. I got first dibs on him. After we get married and have our honeymoon, then you can have your turn, not before." "Oh really? That's some big talk from some who lacks the experience needed in pleasuring a man," Makoto replied. Makoto gave Sienna an angry look when she said, "And pray tell, how do you have such experience? I thought you never let Fugaku touch you, that is, unless you were a rather unfaithful wife." Makoto glared at Sienna and yelled, "I am not a whore, you damn flea-ridden rug." Just as Sienna opened her mouth to respond, Naruto intervened. She was about to tell him to move aside so she could carry on her conversation with Makoto when he put his arms around Sienna and planted a passionate kiss on her. Everyone was taken aback by this, but Sienna was particularly shocked because she was completely unprepared. Sienna quickly melted into Naruto's kiss as a result of her shock. After a short while, he withdrew and noticed Sienna's stunned expression. When he noticed this, he turned to Makoto and did the same to her. This was even more startling because Naruto had previously kept his feelings for her a secret, although it was a little awkward at first, given that he was still a young child when he first developed his crush on her. Naruto knew that it was fairly obvious that he had feelings for her, but now that she was back in his life and he was older, he could act on his feelings for her. In addition, this was an excellent way to exact revenge on her for all of her taunting of him. Makoto and Naruto made out for about a minute, but it was only that long because Makoto had placed her hand behind Naruto's head to prolong the kiss. When they finally pulled away, they were both panting heavily. "That's enough of that, you two. The both of you are very important to me, so can't you both just get along? Or at least try to? For me?" said Naruto with a desperate tone. Makoto and Sienna exchanged glances. Even though they were both in love with Naruto, they were wise enough to avoid possibly ruining their relationship with him by fighting. Thus, they mutually decided to get along, at least for the most part. Naturally, Naruto ignored their brief exchange because he was relieved to have prevented a potentially dangerous altercation between the two of them. In addition to Makoto's inability to fully utilize her Arrancar power, Sienna had been eager to explore the possibilities of her new body. They would require a sizable area to unleash their full power. Even though doing so would result in widespread destruction, maybe they could figure out how to travel to Hueco Mundo. No, that was a very bad idea. It was bad enough that there were hollows in this world. It was just plain foolish to open a Garganta to their world without any sort of plan. In any case, Naruto hoped they reached Wave quickly and dealt with Gato and the hollow or hollows that were probably present. Within Wave, Kurenai Yuhi let out a frustrated sigh at how poorly her mission and life had been going overall. Given that they were all clan heirs, having a genin team would either help or hurt her career as a kunoichi as a recently promoted jonin, depending on how well or poorly she performed with them. A recommendation from Hiyashi Hyuga, who had supported his daughter Hinata as a kind of sister, mother figure, made it possible for a recently promoted jonin to be given a clan heir. Let alone 3. Even so, she wished she had a more manageable team. Like all Aburame, Shino Aburame was very easy to deal with because they were analytical and played everything close to the vest, giving the impression that they were emotionless. In all honesty, she didn't think this was true and that they simply had a more analytical mind than most people for whatever reason. Although his intelligence was a plus, it made it difficult for them to interact with people outside of their clan, and their clan's ability to use bugs caused people to avoid them. Kiba Inuzuka was the next person on her team. He was loud and brash, which was the complete opposite of Shino. For the most part, though, that didn't mean he was foolish or conceited. Many members of his clan were simply like that. They were also very devoted, and the entire clan was supporting Naruto because their current leader, Sume, was friends with Kushina Uzumaki, who was also alive in some way. By this point she had stopped wondering how. None of them harbored any animosity toward Naruto. Rather, the Kyuubi's chakra within him served as a massive warning to their animal instincts, indicating that carrying him would have been problematic and that the hounds would have either been excessively hostile or terrified of him. However, the whole clan was on their side, especially Sume and Kiba, who are friends with Naruto and Kushina, respectively. Hanabi, Hinata's elder sister, was the final member of her team. Where would she begin? The young lady was not like any other member of the Hyuga clan. She was more passionate. Even though she had maintained their usual air of composed indifference, she had an unusually irascible temper and was fierce with her sister. Her position on Naruto Uzumaki, however, was what the new jonin was most worried about. Following his transformation, she would become visibly tense whenever the topic of Naruto was brought up and would only respond in a neutral manner. She might have been chosen because her clan was attempting to negotiate a marriage alliance with Naruto. Given that nobles sought to form alliances, it was undoubtedly a possibility. She only hoped that whatever was happening to her didn't get out of control, because it was clear from Naruto's personal execution of the former Hokage Sarutobi Hiruzen that he had no problem killing people. Speaking of the former Hokage, Hiruzen's actions during his time as Hokage had severely damaged his family and clan. By trying to use Naruto to seize everything that rightfully belonged to him from the Uzumaki clan, the man had egregiously overreached his authority and power. It was a serious offense to manipulate a clan heir, but to try to steal clan secrets and property? That was a completely different problem. There were severe consequences for attempting to steal anything from a clan, regardless of how little or insignificant it was. However, Hiruzen had tried to steal everything that belonged to the Uzumaki clan, and thus the entire Sarutobi clan. The Sarutobi's reputation had been effectively tarnished by what he did. Even though Naruto had killed the person who was behind it all after Hiruzen was put to death, Asuma assumed leadership of the clan and was making every effort to keep things under control. Since Asuma had to work to prevent his clan from disintegrating, this had effectively put a halt to her relationship with the man. There wouldn't even be a relationship with Asuma to salvage if things continued this way. Furthermore, Sasuke had undergone a thorough psychiatric assessment after Tsunade took control of the Leaf, and the findings had been unsettling. Sasuke was reportedly on the verge of losing his mind and turning into a sociopath due to a great deal of mental scarring that was never adequately addressed naturally. Some attempted to claim that he was necessary to support the village's prosperity or something. However, allowing a loose cannon like that would only lead to catastrophe. As a result, Kakashi Hatake, who was supposed to face Sasuke as a student, was left without a squad of his own. Given how close he was to Minato prior to his death, the man's feelings for Naruto Uzumaki had always been questioned, so it's possible that he resented Naruto for it. Just like many of the village idiots did naturally, Tsunade was on his side, and Jiraiya had somehow essentially given in to them after his involvement in the attempt to regain control of him, so it's not like anyone in the village even had the strength to oppose him. However, that was nothing compared to the mess this mission was becoming in the event that more dangerous ninja appeared. Her team had sent word to Konoha for potential reinforcements and had apprehended the Demon Brothers, 2 missing nin naturally. Zabuza Momochi, one of the 7 swordsmen of the mist, was the one who appeared. If Might Guy and his group hadn't arrived, they would have been in serious trouble. Zabuza was powerful, but even he struggled against Guy's ridiculous strength. Naturally, a hunter nin showed up and used 2 senbon to take out Zabuza before they could corner him. Naturally, Kurenai and Guy were perplexed as to why there was only 1 member and not a full team, but they were pressed for time as they raced to the client's home. However, Zabuza wasn't the only issue facing this nation. It seems that a fat little businessman by the name of Gato was draining the nation and making people's lives miserable. Even worse was the fact that people had disappeared and that occasionally both civilians and the bandits Gato had hired would be discovered dead, as though they had been eaten by a big animal. Tazuna informed them that there were no animals in their nation that could do such a thing. In addition, there was a man who would stop at nothing to seize control of this nation, and a ranked missing nin with at least 1 accomplice, and an unidentified ravenous animal prowling around. The situation on this mission had gotten worse by this time. It had actually risen from its alleged B rank to a high A. It might even go further if Gato chose to hire more missing nin, or if he truly had control over the creature that has been consuming people and chose to use it on them directly. Kurenai sensei! Exclaimed Kiba, who rushed in and interrupted Kurenai's reverie. Kurenai asked, "What is it, Kiba?" inquiring as to what had Kina so excited. As he exclaimed, "Hokage-sama sent us news. She's sending us more backup." Everyone turned to stare at him. Tsunami, a pretty young woman with dark hair and fair skin, asked, "More ninja? But surely aren't Kurenai-san and Guy-san more than enough to take on Zabuza?" While that may be true, there is still the matter of the creature killing people, as well as the possibility that Gato might bring in more missing nin. Kiba, do you know who is coming to help us? Replied Might Guy in a rare instance of serious stares. Kiba blinked and gave a nervous laugh at this. Everyone groaned as he said, somewhat embarrassed, "When I got the letter and I read we were getting help, I didn't finish reading it and rushed straight over." Kurenai asked, "Letter? Well, where is it?" Kiba started searching his pockets for the location. At this point, everyone started to perspire, but then his partner Akamaru entered with a scroll in its mouth. He said, "Aha, there it is. Thanks, Akamaru." The dog gave him a muffled bark in response. Hanabi had taken it from the dog's mouth as he reached for it. When Kiba went to object, she discovered that she had already read it quickly. She gave a little gasp at the end, drawing everyone's attention. "Hanabi. What is it? Who is being sent?" Shino questioned, curious as to what had triggered his teammates' outburst. Everyone in the room gasped in surprise when she said, "Hokage-sama is sending someone to help deal with Gato along with Naruto Uzumaki and his entourage here to wave." Just over a week ago, Tsunade had sent Naruto and his group on a covert mission. Given that Naruto had the power to age people to death, they had assumed it was dangerous, not to mention the other individuals who were with him. Some of them, like Kiba, were happy to see his friend again, while the others questioned why they were being sent all those powerhouses when only 1 or 2 more Jonin would have been sufficient. Hanabi was now gripping her chest, and Neji was upset that someone who could resist fate would be coming here. Hanabi thought, Naruto is coming here?
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.